Hello, hello, everyone. Yes, I know we've got time still there for the for ads. So, thank you all for showing up. And I am still reading The Horse and His Boy. So, we've already read Magician's Nephew, which chronologically is the first book. It explains everything of how it came to be in Narnia. Also read Lion the Witch from the Wardrobe and also everything else. Or for that book. Okay. So yeah, welcome back, guys. We are on the third book, The Horse and His Boy, where you had a boy. Apparently, he was captured, and a horse from Narnia showed up and offered to take him back. He met up with another person, and she had a horse from Narnia also, apparently. Two talking horses attempting to take the children back to Narnia with them. So, gonna go ahead and pick up on Chapter 5. My dear sister and very good lady, said King Edmund, you must now show your courage, for I tell you plainly, we are in no small danger. What is it, Edmund? Asked the Queen. It is this, said Edmund. I do not think we shall find it easy to leave Tashbaan. While the Prince had hoped that you would take him, we were honored guests, but by the lion's mane, I think that as soon as he has your flat denial, we shall be no better than prisoners. One of the dwarfs gave a low whistle. I warned your majesties, I warned you, said Swallowpad the raven. Easily in, but not easily out, as the lobster said in the lobster pot. I have been with the prince this morning, continued Edmund. He is little used, more the pity, to having his will crossed, and he is very chafed at your long delays and doubtful answers. This morning he pressed very hard to know your mind. I put it aside, meaning at the same time to diminish his hopes, with some light common jests about women's fancies, and hinted that his suit was likely to be cold. He grew angry and dangerous. There was a sort of threatening, though still veiled under the show of courtesy, in every word he spoke. Yes, said Helios, and when I supped with the Grand Vizier last night, it was the same. He asked how I liked Tashbaan, and I, for I could not tell him I hated every stone of it, and I would not lie, told him that now, when high summer was coming on, my heart turned to the cool woods and dewy slopes of Narnia. He gave a smile that meant no good, and said, there is nothing to hinder you from dancing there again, little Goatfoot, always provided you leave us in exchange a bride for our prince. Do you mean he would make me his wife by force? Exclaimed Susan. That's my fear, Susan, said Edmund. Wife or slave, which is worse? But how can he? Does the Tisroc think our brother, the High King, would suffer such an outrage? Sire, said Peridun to the king, they would not be so mad. Do they think there are no swords or spears in Narnia? Alas, said Edmund, my guess is that the Tisroc has very small fear of Narnia. We are a little land, and little lands on the borders of a great empire are always hateful to the lords of the great empire. He longs to blot them out, gobble them up. When first he suffered the prince to come to Cair Paravel as your lover, sister, it may be that he was only seeking an occasion against us. Most likely he hopes to make one mouthful of Narnia and Archland both. Let him try, said the second dwarf. At sea we are as big as he is, but if he assaults us by land, He has the desert to cross. True, friend, said Edmund, but is the desert a sure defense? What does Swallowpad say? I know that desert well, said the raven, for I have flown above it far and wide in my younger days. You may be sure that Shasta pricked up his ears at this point. And this is certain, that if the Tisroc goes by the great oasis, he can never lead a great army across it to Archenland. For though they could reach the oasis by the end of their first day's march, yet the springs there would be too little for the thirst of all those soldiers and their beasts. But there is another way. Shasta listened more attentively still. He that would find that way, said the raven, must start from the tombs of the ancient kings, and ride northwest so that the double peak of Mount Pyre is always straight ahead of him. And so, in a day's riding, or a little more, he shall come to the head of a stony valley, which is so narrow that a man might be within a furlong of it 1,000 times and never know that it was there. And looking down this valley, he will see neither grass nor water nor anything else good. But if he rides down it, he will come to a river and can ride that water all the way into Archenland. And do the Calormanes know of this western way? Asked the queen. Friends, friends, said Edmund, what is the use of all this discourse? We are not asking whether Narnia or Calormen would win if war arose between them. We are asking how to save the honor of the queen and our own lives out of this devilish city. And though my brother, Peter the High King, defeated the Tisroc 12 times over, yet long before that day our throats would be cut and the queen's grace would be his wife, or more likely, the slave of this prince. We have our weapons, king, said the first dwarf, and this is a reasonably defensible house. As to that, said the king, I do not doubt that every one of us would sell our lives dearly at the gate, and they would not come at the queen, but over our dead bodies. Yet we should be merely rats fighting in a trap when all's said. Very true, croaked the raven. These last stands in a house make good stories, but nothing ever came of them. After their first few repulses, the enemy always sets the house on fire. I am the cause of all of this, said Susan, bursting into tears. Oh, if I only had never left Cair Paravel. Our last happy day was before those ambassadors came from Calormen. The moles were planting an orchard for us. Oh, oh, and she buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Courage, Sue, courage, said Edmund. Remember, but what is the matter with you, Master Helios? For the fawn was holding both his horns in his hands, as if he were trying to keep his head on by them, and writhing to and fro, as if he had a pain inside his head. Don't speak to me, don't speak to me, said Helios. I'm thinking so that I can hardly breathe. Wait, wait, do wait. There was a moment's puzzled silence, and then the fawn looked up, drew a long breath, mopped his forehead, and said, the only difficulty is how to get down to our ship, with some stores, too, without being seen and stopped. Yes, said the dwarf dryly, just as the beggar's only difficulty about riding is that he has no horse. Wait, wait, said Mr. Helios impatiently. All we need is some pretext for going down to our ship today and taking stuff on board. Yes, said King Edmund doubtfully. Well then, said the fawn, how would it be if your majesties bade the prince into a great banquet to be held on board our own galleon, the Splendor Hyaline, tomorrow night, and let the message be worded as graciously as the queen can contrive without pledging her honor, so as to give the prince a hope that she is weakening. This is very good counsel, sire, croaked the raven. And then, continued Helios excitedly, everyone will expect us to be going down to the ship all day, making preparations for our guests, and let some of us go into the bazaars and spend every minim we have at the fruiterers and the sweetmeat sellers and the wine merchants, just as we would if we were really giving a feast. And let us order magicians and jugglers and dancing girls and flute players, all to be on board tomorrow night. I see, said King Edmund, rubbing his hands. And then, said Helios, we'll all be on board tonight, as soon as it is quite dark. Up sails and our out oars, said the king, and to the and so to sea, cried Helios, leaping up and beginning to dance. And our nose northward, said the first dwarf, running for home. Hurrah for Narnia and the north, said the other. And the prince, waking up the next morning and finding his birds flown, said Peredan, clapping his hands. Oh, Master Helios, dear Master Helios, said the queen, catching his hands and swinging with him as he danced, you have saved us all. The prince will chase us, said another lord, whose name Shasta had not heard. That's the least of my fears, said Edmund. I have seen all the shipping in the river, and there's no tall ship of war nor swift galley there. I wish he may chase for us, for the Splendor Hyaline would sink anything he has to send after her, if we were overtaken at all. Sire, said the raven, you shall hear no better plot than the fawn's, though we sat in council for 7 days. And now, as we birds say, nests before eggs, which is as much as to say, let us all take our food, and then at once be about our business. Everyone arose at this, and the doors were opened, and the lords and creatures stood aside for the king and queen to go out first. Shasta wondered what he ought to do, but Mr. Helios said, lie there, your highness, and I will bring you up a little feast to yourself in a few moments. There is no need for you to move until we are all ready to embark. Shasta laid his head down again on the pillows, and soon he was alone in the room. This is perfectly dreadful, thought Shasta. It never came into his head to tell these Narnians the whole truth and ask for their help. Having been brought up by a hard, close-fisted man like Arshish, he had a fixed habit of never telling grown-ups anything if he could help it. He thought that they would always spoil or stop whatever you were trying to do. And he thought that even if the Narnian king might be friendly to the two horses because they were talking beasts of Narnia, he would hate Aravis because she was a Colormene, and either sell her for a slave or send her back to her father. As for himself, I simply daren't tell them I'm not Prince Corin now, thought Shasta. I've heard all their plans. If they knew I wasn't one of themselves, they'd never let me out of this house alive. They'd be afraid I'd betray them to the Tisroc. They'd kill me. And if the real Corin turns up, it'll all come out. And they will. He had, you see, no idea of how noble and free-born people behave. What am I to do? What am I to do? He kept saying to himself. What? Hello, there comes that goody little creature again. The fawn trotted in, half dancing, with a tray in his hands which was nearly as large as itself. This he set on an inlaid table beside Shasta's sofa, and sat down himself on the carpeted floor with his goaty legs crossed. Now, princeling, he said, make a good dinner. It will be your last meal in Tashbaan. It was a fine meal after the Colormene fashion. I don't know whether you would have liked it or not, but Shasta did. There were lobsters and salad, and snipe stuffed with almonds and truffles, and a complicated dish made of chicken livers and rice and raisins and nuts, and there were cool melons and gooseberry fools and mulberry fools, and even every kind of nice thing that can be made with ice. There was also a little flagon of sort of wine that is called white, though it is really yellow. While Shasta was eating, the good little fawn, who thought he was still dazed with sunstroke, kept talking to him about fine times he would have when they all got home, about his good old father, King Loon of Archenland, and the little castle where he lived on the southern slopes of the pass. And don't forget, said Mr. Helios, that you are promised your first suit of armor and your first war horse on your next birthday, and then your highness will begin to learn how to til- tilt and joust. And in a few years, if all goes well, King Peter had promised your royal father that he himself will make you knight at Cair Paravel, and in the meantime there will be plenty of comings and goings between Narnia and Archenland across the neck of the mountains. And of course, you remember, you have promised to come for a whole week and stay with me for the summer festival, and there'll be bonfires and all-night dances of fauns and dryads in the heart of the woods, and, who knows, we might see Aslan himself. When the meal was over, the faun told Shasta to stay quietly where he was, and it won't do to have you and it won't do you any harm to have a little sleep, he added. I'll call you in plenty of time to get on board, and then home, Narnia and the North. Shasta had so enjoyed his dinner and all the things Helios had been telling him that when was left alone, his thoughts took a different turn. He only hoped now that the real Prince Corin would not turn up until it was too late, and that he would be taken away to Narnia by ship. I am afraid he did not think at all of what might happen to the real Corin when he was left behind in Tashbaan. He was a little worried about Aravis and Bree waiting for him at the tombs. But then he said to himself, well, how can I help it? And anyway, that Aravis thinks she's too good to go about with me, so she can jolly well go alone. And at the same time, he couldn't help feeling that it would be much nicer going to Narnia by sea than toiling across the desert. When he had thought all this, he did what I expect you would have done if you had been up very early and had a long walk and a great deal of excitement, and then a very good meal, and were lying on a sofa in a cool room with no noise in it, except when a bee came buzzing in through the wide open windows. He fell asleep. When he woke, what woke him was a loud crash. He jumped up off the sofa, staring. He saw at once, from the mere look of the room, the lights and shadows all looked different, that he must have been asleep for several hours. He saw also what made the crash. A costly porcelain vase, which had been standing on the window sill, lay on the floor broken into about 30 pieces. But he hardly noticed all these things. What he did notice was two hands gripping the window sill from outside. They gripped harder and harder, getting white at the knuckles, and then up came a head and a pair of shoulders. A moment later there was a boy of Shasta's own age sitting astride the sill with one leg hanging down inside the room. Shasta had never seen his own face in a looking-glass. Even if he had, he might not have realized that the other boy was, at ordinary times, almost exactly like himself. At that moment, this boy was not particularly like anyone, for he had the finest black eye you ever saw, and a tooth missing, and his clothes, which must have been splendid ones when he put them on, were torn and dirty, and there was both blood and mud on his face. "Who are you?" said the boy in a whisper. "Are you Prince Corin?" said Shasta. "Yes, of course," said the other. "But who are you?" "I'm nobody. Nobody in particular, I mean," said Shasta. "King Edmund caught me in the street, and mistook me for you. I suppose we must look like one another. I can get out of the way, and, er, can I get out the way you've got in?" "Yes, if you're any good at climbing," said Corin. "But why are you in such a hurry? I say, we ought to be able to get some fun out of this being mistaken for one another." "No, no," said Shasta. "We must change places at once. It'll be simply frightful if Mr. Helios comes back and finds us both here. I've had to pretend to be you, and you're starting tonight, secretly." "And where were you all this time?" "A boy in the street made a beastly joke about Queen Susan," said Prince Corin, so I knocked him down. He ran howling into a house, and his big brother came out, so I knocked the big brother down. Then they all followed me until we ran into three old men with spears, who were called the Watch. So I fought the Watch, and they knocked me down. It was getting dark by now. Then the Watch took me along to lock me up somewhere. So I asked them if they'd like a stoup of wine, and they said they didn't mind if they did. Then I took them to a wine shop and got them some, and they all sat down and drank till they fell asleep. I thought it was time for me to be off, so I came out quietly, and then I found the first boy, the one who had started all the trouble, still hanging about. So I knocked him down again, after I climbed up a pipe onto the roof of a house, and lay quiet till it began to get light this morning. Ever since that, I've been finding my way back. I say, is there anything to drink? No, I drank it, said Shasta. And now, show me how you got in. There's not a minute to lose. You'd better lie down on the sofa and pretend. But I forgot. It'll be no good with all those bruises and black eye. You'll just have to tell them the truth, once I'm safely away. What else do you think I'm telling them? Asked the prince with a rather angry look. And who are you? There's no time, said Shasta in a frantic whisper. I'm a Narnian, I believe. Something northern, anyway. But I've been brought up all my life in Galerman, and I'm escaping across the desert with a talking horse called Bree. And now, quick, how do I get away? Look, said Corn, drop from this window onto the roof of the veranda. But you must do it lightly, on your toes, or someone will hear you. Then along to your left you can get up to the top of that wall if you are any good at all as a climber. Then along the wall to the corner. Drop onto the rubbish heap you will find outside. And there you are. Thanks, said Shasta, who was already sitting on the sill. The two boys were looking into each other's face, and suddenly found that they were friends. Goodbye, said Corin, and good luck. I do hope you get safe away. Goodbye, said Shasta. I say, you have been having some adventures. Nothing to yours, said the prince. Now drop, lightly, I say. He added as Shasta dropped. I hope we meet in Archenland. Go to my father, King Loon, and tell him you're a friend of mine. Look out, I hear someone coming. Shasta ran lightly along the roof on tiptoes. It felt hot to his bare feet. He was only a few seconds scrambling up the wall at the far end. When he got into the corner, he found himself looking down into a narrow, smelly street, and there was a rubbish heap against the outside of the wall, just as Corn had told him. Before jumping down, he took a rapid glance around him to get his bearings. Apparently, he had now come over the crown of the island hill on which Tashbaan was built. Everything sloped away before him, flat roofs, below flat roofs, down to the towers and battlements of the city's northern wall. Beyond that was the river, and beyond the river a short slope covered with gardens. But beyond that again, there was something he had never seen the like of, a great yellowish-gray thing, flat as a calm sea, and stretching for miles. On the far side of it were huge blue things, lumpy, but with jagged edges, and some of them with white tops. The desert, the mountains, thought Shasta. He jumped down onto the rubbish and began trotting along downhill as fast as he could in the narrow lane, which soon brought him into a wider street where there were more people. No one bothered to look at a little ragged boy running along on bare feet. Still, he was anxious and uneasy until he turned a corner and there saw the city gate in front of him. Here he was pressed and jostled a bit, for a good many of the other people were also going out, and on the bridge beyond the gate the crowd became quite a slow procession, more like a queue than a crowd. Out there, with clear running water on each side, it was deliciously fresh after the smell and heat and noise of Tashbaan. When once Shasta had reached the far end of the bridge, he found the crowd melting away. Everyone seemed to be going either to the left or right along the riverbank. He went straight up ahead, a road that did not appear to be much used. Between gardens, in a few paces, he was alone, and a few more brought him to the top of the slope. There he stood and stared. It was like coming to the end of the world, for all the grass stopped quite suddenly a few feet before him, and the sand began, endless level sand, like on a seashore, but a bit rougher because it was never wet. Thank you, Tiger. The mountains, which now looked further off than before, loomed ahead. Greatly to his relief, he saw, about 5 minutes' walk away to his left, what must clearly be the tombs, just as Bree had described them. Great masses of moldering stone shaped like gigantic beehives, but a little narrower. They looked very black and grim, for the sun was now setting right behind them. He turned his face west and trotted toward the tombs. He could not help looking out very hard for any sign of his friends, though the setting sun shone in his face so that he could see hardly anything. And anyway, he thought, of course they'll be round on the far side of the farthest tomb, not this side where anyone might see them from the city. There were about 12 tombs, each with a low arched doorway that opened into absolute blackness. They were dotted about in no kind of order, so that it took a long time going round this one and going round that one before you could be sure that you had looked round every corner of every tomb. This was what Shasta had to do. There was nobody there. It was very quiet here, out on the edge of the desert, and now the sun had really set. Suddenly, from somewhere behind him, there came a terrible sound. Shasta's heart gave a great jump, and he had to bite his tongue to keep himself from screaming. Next moment, he realized what it was. The horns of Tashban blowing for the closing of the gates. Be a silly little coward, Shasta to himself. It's only the same noise you heard this morning, but there was a great difference between a noise heard letting you in with your friends in the morning, heard alone at nightfall, shutting you out. And now that the gates were shut, he knew there was no chance of the others joining that evening. Either they're shut up in Tashban for the night, thought Shasta, or else they've gone on without me. It's just the sort of thing that Aravis would do, but Bree wouldn't. Wouldn't. In this idea about Aravis, Shasta was once more quite wrong. She was proud and could be hard enough, but she was as true as steel and would never have deserted a companion, whether she liked him or not. Now that Shasta knew he would have to spend the night alone, it was getting darker every minute. He began to like the look of the place less and less. There was something very uncomfortable about those great, silent shapes of stone. He had been trying his hardest for a long time not to think of ghouls any longer. Ow, ow, help! He shouted suddenly, for at that very moment he felt something touch his leg. I don't think anyone can be blamed for shouting if something comes up from behind and touches him. Not in such a place and at such a time, when he is frightened already. Shasta, at any rate, was too frightened to run. Anything would be better than being chased round and round the burial places of the ancient kings with something he dared not, or with something he dared not look behind him. Instead, he did what was really the most sensible thing he could do. He looked round, and his heart was almost burst with relief. What he had touched was only a cat. The light was too bad now for Shasta to see much of the cat, except that it was big and very solemn. It looked as if it might have lived for long, long years among the tombs alone. eyes made you think it knew secrets it would not tell. Cat, said Shasta. I hope you're not a talking cat. The cat stared at him harder than ever. Then it started walking away, and of course Shasta followed it. It led him right through the tombs, out on the desert side of them. There it sat down, bolt upright, with its tail curled around its feet, and its face set toward the desert and towards Narnia and the north, as still as if it were waiting for some. Shasta lay down beside it, with his back against the cat, and his face toward the tombs, because if one is nervous, there is nothing like having your face toward the having something warm and solid at your back. The sand wouldn't have seemed very comfortable to you, but Shasta had been sleeping on the ground for weeks and hardly noticed it. Very soon he fell asleep, though even in his dreams he went on wondering what had happened to Bree and Erebus and when. He was wakened suddenly by a noise that he had never heard before. Perhaps it was only a nightmare, said Shasta to himself. At the same moment he noticed that the cat had gone from his back, and he wished it hadn't. He lay quite still without even opening his eyes, because he felt sure he would be more frightened if he sat up and looked round at the tombs and the loneliness, just as you or I might lie still with bedclothes over our heads. But then the noise came again, a harsh, piercing cry from behind him out of the desert. And of course, he had to open his eyes and sit up. The moon was shining brightly. The tombs, far bigger and nearer than he had thought they would be, looked gray in the moonlight. In fact, they looked horribly like huge people draped in gray robes that covered their heads and faces. They were not at all nice things to have near you when spending the night alone in a strange place. But the noise had come from the opposite side, from the desert. Shasta had to turn his back on the tombs. He didn't like that much. And stare out across the level sand. A wild cry rang out again. More lions, thought Shasta. It was, in fact, not very like the lion roars he had heard on the night when they met Erebus, and was really the cry of a jackal. But of course, Shasta did not know this. Even if he had known, he would not have wanted very much to meet a jackal. Cries ran out again and again. There's whatever they are, thought Shasta, and they're coming nearer. I suppose that if he had been an entirely sensible boy, he would have gone back through the tombs, nearer to the river where there were houses, and wild beasts would be less to come. But then there were, or so he thought there were, the ghouls. To go back through the tombs would mean going past those dark openings in the tombs, and what might come out of them. It might have been silly, but Shasta felt he would rather risk the wild beasts. Then, as the cries came nearer and nearer, he began to change his mind. He was just going to run for it when suddenly, between him and the desert, a huge animal bounded into view. As the moon was behind it, it looked quite black, and Shasta did not know what it was, except that it was very big, shaggy head, and went on. It did not seem to have noticed Shasta, for it suddenly stopped, turned its head toward the desert, and let out a roar which echoed through the tombs, and seemed to shake the sand under Shasta's feet. The cries of the other creatures suddenly stopped, and he thought he could hear feet scampering away. Then the great beast turned to examine Shasta. It's a lion. I know it's a lion, thought Shasta. I'm done. I wonder, will it hurt much? I wish it was over. I wonder, does anything happen to people after they're dead? Uh, oh, here it comes. And he shut his eyes and his teeth tight. Instead of teeth and claws, he only felt something warm lying down at his feet. When he opened his eyes, he said, Nearly as big as I thought. It's only half the size. No, it isn't even a quarter of the size. I do declare, it's only the cat. I must have dreamed all that about its being as big as a horse. And whether he really had been dreaming or not, what was now lying at his feet and staring him out of countenance with its big, green, unwinking eyes, cat, though certainly one of the largest cats he had ever seen. Kitty, gasped Shasta, I am so glad to see you again. I have been having such horrid dreams. And he at once lay down again, back to back with the cat, as they had been at the beginning of the night. The warmth from it spread all over him. I'll never do anything nasty to a cat again, as long as I live, said Shasta, half to the cat, half to himself. I did once, you know. Threw stones at a half-starved, mangy old stray. Hey, stop that! For the cat had turned round and gave him a scratch. None of that, said Shasta. It isn't as if you could understand what I'm saying. He dozed off. Next morning, when he woke, the cat was gone. The sun was already up, and the sand hot. Shasta, very thirsty, sat up and rubbed his eyes. The desert was blindingly white, and, though there was a murmur of noises from the city behind him, sorry, sneeze attack. The desert was blindingly white, and, though there was a murmur of noises from the city behind him, where he sat, everything was perfectly still. When he looked a little left and west, so the sun was not in his eyes, he could see the mountains on the far side of the desert, so sharp and clear that they looked only a stone's throw away. He particularly noticed one blue height that divided into two peaks at the top, and decided it must be Mount Pyre. That's our direction, judging by what the raven said, he thought, so I'll just make sure of it, so as not to waste any time when the others show up. So he made a good, deep, straight furrow with his foot, pointing exactly to Mount Pyre. The next job, clearly, was to get something to eat and drink. Shasta trotted back through the tombs. They looked quite ordinary now, and he wondered how he could have ever been afraid of them, and down into the cultivated land by the river's side. There were a few people about, but not very many, for the city gates had been open several hours in the morning, er, and the early morning crowds had already gone in, so he had no difficulty in doing a little raiding, as Bray had called it. It involved a climb over a garden wall, and the results were 3 oranges, a melon, a fig or two, and a pomegranate. After that, he went down to the river bank, but not too near the bridge, and had a drink. The water was so nice that he took off his hot, dirty clothes and had a dip, for of course Shasta, having lived on the shore all his life, had learned to swim almost as soon as he had learned to walk. When he came out, he lay on the grass, looking across the water at Tashbaan, all the splendor and strength and glory of it. But that made him remember the dangers of it too. He suddenly realized that the others might have reached the tombs while he was bathing, and gone on without me, as likely as not. So he dressed in the fright, and tore back at such a speed that he was all hot and thirsty when he arrived, and so the good of his bathe was gone. Hey, Anzan, how's it going? Like most days, when you are alone and waiting for something, this day seemed about 100 hours long. He had plenty to think of course, but sitting alone, just thinking, is pretty slow. He thought a good deal about the Narnians, and especially about Corin. He wondered what had happened when they discovered that the boy who had been lying on the sofa and hearing all their secret plans wasn't really Corin at all. It was very unpleasant to think of all those nice people imagining him a traitor. But as the sun slowly climbed up to the top of the sky, and then slowly began going downward to the west, and no one came, and nothing at all happened, he began to get more and more anxious. And of course, he now realized that when they arranged to wait for one another at the tombs, no one had said anything about how long. He couldn't wait here for the rest of his life, and as soon as it would be dark again, and he would have another night just like last night. A dozen different plans went through his head, all wretched ones, and at last he fixed on the worst plan of all. He decided to wait till it was dark, and then go back to the river and steal as many melons as he could carry, and set out for Mount Pyre alone, trusting for his direction to the line he had drawn that morning in the sand. It was a crazy idea, and if he had read as many books as you have about journeys over deserts, he would never have dreamed of it. But Shasta had read no books at all. Before the sun set, something did happen. Shasta was sitting in the shadow of one of the tombs when he looked up and saw two horses coming toward him. Then his heart gave a great leap, for he recognized them as Bree and Hwin. But the next moment his heart went down to his toes again. There was no sign of Erebus. The horses were being led by a strange man, an armed man, pretty handsomely dressed like an upper slave in a great family. Bree and Hwin were no longer got up like pack horses, but saddled and bridled. And what could it all mean? It's a trap, thought Shasta. Somebody has caught Erebus, and perhaps they've tortured her, and she's given the whole thing away. They want me to jump out and run up and speak to Bree, and then I'll be caught too. And yet, if I don't, I may be losing my only chance to meet the others. Oh, I do wish I knew what had happened. And he skulked behind the tomb, looking out every few minutes and wondering which was the least dangerous thing to do. What had really happened was this. When Erebus saw Shasta hurried away by the Narnians and found herself alone with two horses who, very wisely, wouldn't say a word, she never lost her head for even a moment. She grabbed Bree's halter and stood still, holding both horses, and though her heart was beating as hard as a hammer, she did nothing to show it. As soon as the Narnian lords had passed, she tried to move on again, but before she could take a step, another crier, "Bother all these people," thought Erebus, was heard shouting out, "Way, way, way, way for their Tarkina Lasaraleen," and immediately, following the crier, came four armed slaves, and then four bearers, carrying a litter which was all aflutter with silken curtains, and all a-jingle with silver bells, and which scented the whole street with perfumes and flowers. After the litter, female slaves in beautiful clothes, then a few grooms, runners, pages, and the like. And now Erebus made her first mistake. She knew Lasar Lasaraleen quite well, almost as if they had been at school together, because they had often stayed in the same houses and had been to the same parties. And Erebus couldn't help looking up to see what Lasaraleen looked like now that she was married, and a very great person indeed. It was fatal. The eyes of the two girls met, and immediately Lasaraleen sat up on the litter and burst out at the top of her voice. "Erebus, what on earth are you doing here? Your father—" There was not a moment to lose. Without a second's delay, Erebus let go of the horses, caught the edge of the litter, swung herself up beside Lasaraleen, and whispered furiously in her ear, "Shut up! Do you hear? Shut up! You must hide me. Tell your people." But darling, began Lasarline in the same loud voice. She didn't in the least mind making people stare. In fact, she rather liked it. Do what I tell you, or I'll never speak to you again, hissed Erebus. Please, please be quick, lass. It's frightfully important. Tell your people to bring those two horses along. Pull all the curtains of the litter, and get away somewhere where I can't be found. And do hurry. All right, darling, said Lasarline in her lazy voice. Here, two of you take the Tarquina's horses. This was to the slaves. And now home. I say, darling, do you think we really want the curtains drawn on a day like this? I mean to say, but Erebus had already drawn the curtains, enclosing Lasarline and herself in a rich and scented, but rather stuffy, kind of tent. I mustn't be seen, she said. My father doesn't know I'm here. I'm running away. My dear, how perfectly thrilling, said Lasarline. I'm dying to hear all about it. Darling, you're sitting on my dress. Do you mind? That's better. It is a new one. Do you like it? I got it at— Oh, Laz, do be serious, said Erebus. Where is my father? Didn't you know? Said Lasarline. He's here, of course. He came to town yesterday and is asking about you everywhere. And to think of you and me being here together, and his not knowing anything about it. It's the funniest thing I ever heard. And she went off into giggles. She always had been a terrible giggler, as Erebus now remembered. It isn't funny at all, she said. It's dreadfully serious. Where can you hide me? No difficulty at all, my dear girl, said Lasarline. I'll take you home. My husband's away, and no one will see you. Whew, it's not much fun with the curtains drawn. I want to see people. There's no point in having a new dress on if no one's going to or if one's going to shut up like this. I hope no one heard you when you shouted out to me like that, said Erebus. No, no, of course, darling, said Lasarline absent-mindedly. But you haven't even told me what you think of the dress. Another thing, said Erebus. You must tell your people to treat those two horses very respectfully. That's part of the secret. They're really talking horses from Narnia. Fancy, said Lasarline. How exciting! And oh, darling, have you seen the barbarian queen from Narnia? She's staying in Tashban at present. They say Prince Rabadosh is madly in love with her. There have been the most wonderful parties and hunts and things all this last fortnight. I can't see that she's so very pretty myself, but some of the Narnian men are lovely. I was taken out on a river party the day before yesterday, and I was wearing my— How shall we prevent your people telling everyone that you've got a visitor, dressed like a beggar's brat, in your house? It might so easily get round to my father. Now, don't keep on fussing, there's a dear, said Lasarline. We'll get you some proper clothes in a moment. And here we are. The bearers had stopped, and the litter was being lowered. When the curtains had been drawn, Aravis found that she was in a courtyard garden, very like the one that Shasta had been taken to a few minutes earlier in another part of the city. Lasarlian would have gone indoors at once, but Aravis reminded her in a frantic whisper to say something to the slaves about not telling anyone of their mistress's strange visitor. Sorry, darling, it had gone right out of my head, said Lasarline. Here, all of you, and you, doorkeeper, no one is to be let out of this house today, and anyone I catch talking about this young lady will be the first beaten to death, and then burned alive, and after that be kept on bread and water for 6 weeks. There. Although Lasarline had said she was dying to hear Aravis's story, she showed no sign of really wanting to hear it at all. She was, in fact, much better at talking than at listening. She insisted on Aravis having a long and luxurious bath— Colormine baths are famous— and then dressing her up in the finest clothes before she would let her explain anything. The fuss she made about choosing the dresses nearly drove Aravis mad. She remembered how that now that Lasarline had always been like that, interested in clothes and parties and gossip. Aravis had always been more interested in bows and arrows and horses and dogs and swimming. You will guess that each thought the other silly, but when at last they both seated after a meal, it was chiefly of the whipped cream and jelly and fruit and ice sort, in a beautiful pillared room, which Aravis would have liked better if Lasaraline's spoiled pet monkey hadn't been climbing about it all the time. Lasaraline at last asked her why she was running away from home. When Aravis had finished telling her story, Lasarline said, "But, darling, why don't you marry Ahoshta Tarkan? Everyone's crazy about him. My husband said he's beginning to be one of the greatest men in Colorman. He has just been made Grand Vizier, now old Axartha has died. Didn't you know?" "I don't care. I can't stand the sight of him," said Aravis. "But, darling, only think. 3 palaces, and one of them that beautiful one down on the lake at Ilkeen. Positively ropes of pearls, I'm told. Baths of ass's milk, and you'll see such a lot of me." "He can keep his pearls and palaces as far as I'm concerned," said Aravis. "You always were a queer girl, Aravis," said Lasarline. "What more do you want?" At the end, however, Aravis managed to make her friend believe that she was in earnest, and even to discuss plans. There would be no difficulty now about getting the 2 horses out to the north gate, and then on to the tombs. No one would stop or question a groom in fine silk clothes leading a war horse and a lady's saddle horse down to the river, and Lasarline had plenty of grooms to send. It wasn't so easy to decide what to do about Aravis herself. She suggested that she could be carried out in the litter with the curtains drawn, but Lasarline told her that litters were only used in the city, and the sight of one going out through the gate would be certain to lead to questions. When they had all talked for a long time, and it was all the longer because Aravis found it hard to keep her friend to the point, at last Lasarline clapped her hands and said, "Oh, I have an idea. There is one way of getting out of the city without using the gates. The Tisrock's garden, may he live forever, runs right down to the water, and there is a little water door. Only for the palace people, of course. But then, you know, dear," here she tittered a little, "we almost are palace people. I say, it is lucky for you that you came to me. The dear Tisroc, may he live forever, is so kind. We're asked to the palace almost every day, and it is like a second home. I love all the dear princes and princesses, and I positively adore Prince Rabadash. I might run in and see any of the palace ladies at any hour of the day or night. Why shouldn't I slip in with you, after dark, and let you out by the water door? There are always a few punts and things tied up outside it, and even if we were caught, all would be lost," said Aravis. "Oh, darling, don't get so excited," said Lasarline. "I was going to say, even if we were caught, everyone would only say it was one of my mad jokes. I'm getting quite well known for them. Only the other day— Do listen, dear. This is frightfully funny." "I, I meant it would be lost for me," said Aravis a little sharply. "Oh, ah, yes. I do see what you mean, darling. Well, can you think of any better plan?" "Oh, not tonight," said Lasarline. "Of course, not tonight. There's a great feast on tonight. I must start getting my hair done for it in a few minutes, and the whole place will be a blaze of lights, and such a crowd, too. It would have to be tomorrow night." This was bad news for Aravis, but she had to make the best of it. The afternoon passed very slowly, and it was a relief when Lasarline went out to the banquet, for Aravis was very tired of her giggling and her talk about dresses and parties, weddings and engagements and scandals. She went to bed early, and that part she did enjoy, It was so nice to have pillows and sheets again. But the next day passed very slowly. Lasarline wanted to go back on the whole arrangement and kept on telling Aravis that Narnia was a country of perpetual snow and ice, inhabited by demons and sorcerers, and she was mad to think of going there. "And with a peasant boy, too," said Lasarline. "Darling, think of it. It's not nice." Aravis had thought of it a good deal, but she was so tired of Lasarline's silliness by now that, for the first time, she began to think that traveling with Shasta was really rather more fun than fashionable life in Tashbaan. So she only replied, "You forget that I'll be nobody, just like him, when we get to Narnia. And anyway, I promised." "And to think," said Lasarline, almost crying, "that if only you had sense, you could be the wife of the Grand Vizier." Iris went away to have a private word with the horses. "You must go with the groom a little before sunset down to the tombs," she said. "No more of those packs. You'll be saddled and bridled again, but there'll have to be food in Hwyn's saddlebags and a full waterskin behind yours, Bree. The man has orders to let you both have a good long drink at the far side of the bridge." "And then Narnia and the North?" whispered Bree. "But what if Shasta is not in the tombs?" "Wait for him, of course," said Aravis. "I hope you've been quite comfortable." "Never been stabled in my life," said Bree. "But if the husband of the tittering Tarkina friend of yours is paying his head groom to get the best oats, then I think the head groom is cheating him." Aravis and Larkina had supper in the pillared room. About 2 hours later they were ready to start. Aravis was dressed to look like a superior slave girl in a great house, and wore a veil over her face. They had all agreed that if any questions were asked, Lasarline would pretend that Aravis was a slave she was taking as a present to one of the princesses. The two girls went out on foot, and a very few minutes brought them to the palace gates. Here there were of course soldiers on guard, but the officer knew Lasarline quite well and called his men to attention and saluted. They passed at once into the hall of black marble. A fair number of courtiers, slave, and others were still moving about here, but it only made the two girls less conspicuous. They passed on into the hall of pillars, and then into the hall of statues, and down to the colonnade, passing the great beaten copper doors of the throne room. It was all magnificent beyond description, what they could see of it in the dim light of the lamps. Presently they came out into the garden court, which sloped downhill in a number of terraces. On the far side of that they came to the old palace. It had already grown almost quite dark, and they now found themselves in a maze of corridors lit only by occasional torches fixed in brackets to the wall. Lasarline halted at a place where you had to go either left or right. "Go on, do go on," whispered Aravis, whose heart was beating terribly, and who felt that her father might run into them at any quarter. "I was just wondering," said Lasarline. "I'm not absolutely sure which way we go from here. I think it's the left. Yes, I'm almost sure it's the left. What fun this is!" They took the left-hand way and found themselves in a passage that was hardly lit at all, and which soon began going downstairs. "It's all right," said Lasarline. "I'm sure we're right now. I remember these steps." But at that moment a moving light appeared ahead. A second later there appeared from round a distant corner the dark shapes of two men walking backward and carrying tall candles. And of course it is only before royalties that people walk backwards. Aravis felt Lasarline grip her arm, the sort of sudden grip which is almost a pinch, and which means that the person who is gripping you is very frightened indeed. Aravis thought it odd that Lasarline should be afraid of the Tisroc if he was really such a friend of hers, But there was no time to go on thinking. Lasaraline was hurrying her back to the top of the steps, on tiptoes, and groping wildly along the wall. "Here's a door," she whispered. "Quick." They went in, drew the door very softly behind them, and found themselves in pitch darkness. Aravis could hear Lasaraline's breathing, that she was terrified. "Tosh preserve us," whispered Lasaraline. "What shall we do if he comes in here? Can we hide?" There was a soft carpet under their feet. They groped forward into the room and blundered into a sofa. "Let's lie down behind it," whimpered Lasarline. "Oh, I do wish we hadn't come." There was just room between the sofa and the curtained wall, and the two girls got down. Lasarline managed to get the better position, and was completely covered. The upper part of Aravis's face stuck out beyond the sofa, so that if anyone came into the room with a light and happened to look exactly in the right place, they would see her. But of course, because she was wearing a veil, what they saw would not at once look like a forehead and a pair of eyes. Aravis shoved desperately to try to make Lasaraline give her more room, but Lasaraline, now quite selfish in her panic, fought back and pinched her feet. They gave it up and lay still, panting a little. Their own breath seemed dreadfully noisy, and there was no other noise. "Is it safe?" said Aravis, at last in the tiniest possible whisper. "I I I think so," began Lasarline, "but my poor nerves—" And then came the most terrible noise they could have heard in that moment, the noise of the door opening. And then light came in light, and because Aravis couldn't get her head any further behind the sofa, she saw everything. First came the two slaves, deaf and dumb, as Aravis rightly guessed, and therefore used at the most secret council, walking backwards and carrying the candles. They took up their stand, one at each end of the sofa. This was a good thing, for of course it was now harder for anyone to see Aravis once a slave was in front of her and she was looking between his heels. Then came an old man, very fat, wearing a curious pointed cap, by which she immediately knew that he was the Tisroc. The least of the jewels which he was covered was worth more than all the clothes and weapons of the Narnian lords put together. And he was so fat and such a mass of frills and pleats and baubles and buttons and tassels and talismans that Aravis couldn't help thinking the Narnian fashions, at any rate for men, looked nicer. After him came a tall young man with a feathered and jeweled turban on his head and an ivory-sheathed scimitar at his side. He seemed very excited, and his eyes and teeth flashed fiercely in the candlelight. Last of all came a little hump-backed, wizened old man, in whom she recognized with a shudder as the new Grand Vizier and her own betrothed husband, Ahoshta Tarkan himself. As soon as all three had entered the room and the door was shut, the Tisroc seated himself on the divan, and with a sigh of contentment. The young man took his place, standing before him, and the Grand Vizier got down on his knees and elbows and laid his face flat on the carpet. "Oh, my father, and oh, the delight of my eyes," began the young man, muttering the words very quickly and sulkily, and not at all as if the Tisroc were the delight of his eyes. "May you live forever, but you have utterly destroyed me. If you had given me the swiftest of the galleys at sunrise, when I first saw that the ship of the accursed barbarians was gone from her place, I would perhaps have overtaken them. But you persuaded me to send first and see if they were not merely moved round the point into better anchorage. And now the whole day has been wasted. They are gone, gone, out of my reach. The false jade, the—" And here he added a great many descriptions of Queen Susan which would not look at all nice in print. For of course this young man was Prince Rabadash, and of course the false jade was Susan of Narnia. "Compose yourself, O my son," said the Tisroc, For the departure of guests makes a wound that is easily healed in the heart of a judicious host. But I want her, cried the prince. I must have her. I shall die if I do not get her. False, proud, black-hearted daughter of a dog that she is. I cannot sleep, and my food has no savor, and my eyes are darkened because of her beauty. I must have the barbarian queen. How well it is said by a gifted poet, observed the vizier, raising his face, in a somewhat dusty condition, from the carpet, that deep draughts from the fountain of reason are desirable in order to extinguish the fire of youthful love. This seemed to exasperate the prince. Dog, he shouted, directing a series of well-aimed kicks at the hindquarters of the vizier. Do not dare to quote the poets to me. I have had maxims and verses flung at me all day, and I can endure them no more. I'm afraid Aravis did not feel at all very sorry for the vizier. The Tisroc was apparently sunk in thought, but when, after a long pause, he noticed what was happening, he said tranquilly, "My son, by all means desist from kicking the venerable and enlightened vizier, for as a costly jewel retains its value even if hidden in the dunghill, so old age and discretion are to be respected even in the vile persons of our subjects. Desist, therefore, and tell us what you desire and propose." "I desire and propose, O my father," said Rabadash, "that you immediately call out your invincible armies and invade the thrice accursed land of Narnia, and waste it with fire and sword, and add it to your illimitable empire, killing their high king and all his blood except the Queen Susan, for I must have her as my wife, though she shall learn a sharp lesson first." "Understand, O my son," said the Tisroc, "that no words you can speak will move me to open war against Narnia." "If you were not my father, O ever-living Tisroc," said the prince, grinding his teeth, "I should say that was the word of a coward. And if you were not my son, O most inflammable Rabadash," replied his father, "your life would be short and your death slow when you had said it." The cool, placid voice of which he spoke these words made Aravis's blood run cold. "But why, O father," said the prince, this time in a much more respectful voice, "why should we think twice about punishing Narnia any more than about hanging an idle slave or sending a worn-out horse to be made into dog's meat? It is not the fourth size of one of your least provinces. 1,000 spears could conquer it in 5 weeks. It is an unseemly blot on the skirts of your empire." "Most undoubtedly," said the Tisroc. "These little barbarian countries that call themselves free, which is as much to say idle, distorted, and unprofitable, are hateful to the gods and to all persons of discernment. Then why have we suffered such a land as Narnia to remain thus long unsubdued?" "Know, O enlightened prince," said the Grand Vizier, "that until the year in which your exalted father began his salutary and unending reign, the land of Narnia was covered with ice and snow, and was moreover ruled by the most powerful enchantress." "This I know very well, O loquacious vizier," answered the prince, "but I know also that the enchantress is dead, and the ice and snow have vanished, so that Narnia is now wholesome, fruitful, and delicious. And this change, O most learned prince, has doubtless been brought to pass by the powerful incantations of those wicked persons who now call themselves kings and queens of Narnia." "All this," said the "I am rather of that opinion," said Rabadash, "that it is come about by the altercation of the stars and the operation of natural causes." "All this," said the Tisroc, "is a question for the disputations of learned men. I will never believe that so great an altercation and the killing of the old enchantress were effected without the aid of strong magic. and such things are to be expected in the land, which is chiefly inhabited by demons in the shape of beasts that talk like men, and monsters that are half man and half beast. It is commonly reported that the High King of Narnia, whom many the gods utterly reject, is supported by a demon of hideous aspect and irresistible maleficence, who appears in the shape of a lion. Therefore, the attacking of Narnia is a dark and doubtful enterprise, and I am determined not to put my hand out farther than I can draw it back. How blessed is Caliban, said the vizier, popping up his face again, on whose ruler the gods have been pleased to bestow prudence and circumspection. Yet, as the irrefutable and sapient Tisroc has said, it is very grievous to be constrained to keep our hands off such a dainty dish as Narnia. Gifted was the poet who said, but at this point Ahoshta noticed an impatient movement of the prince's toe and became suddenly quiet. It is very grievous, said Tisroc in his deep, quiet voice. Every morning the sun is darkened in my eyes, and every night my sleep is less refreshing, because I remember that Narnia is still free. Oh, my father, said Rabadash, how if I show you a way by which you can stretch out your arm and take Narnia, and yet draw it back unharmed if the attempt prove unfortunate? If you can show me that, O Rabadash, said Tisroc, you will be the best of sons. Here then, O father, this very night and in this hour, I will take but 200 horses and ride across the desert, and it shall seem to all men that you know nothing of my going. On the second morning I shall be at the gates of King Lune's castle on of Anvard in Archenland. They are at peace with us and unprepared, and I shall take Anvard before they have bestirred themselves. Then I shall ride through the pass above Anvard and down through Narnia to Cair Paravel. The High King will not be there. When I left them, he was already preparing a raid against the giants on his northern border. I shall find Cair Paravel, most likely with open gates, and ride in. I shall exercise prudence and courtesy, and spill as little Narnian blood as I can. And what then remains but to sit there till the Splendor Hyaline puts in, with Queen Susan on board, catch my strayed bird as she sets foot ashore, swing her into the saddle, and then ride back to Anvard? But it is not probable, O my son, said the Tisroc, that at the taking of this woman either King Edmund or you will lose your life. They will be a small company, said Rabadash, and I will order 10 of my men to disarm and bind him, restraining any vehement desire for his blood, so that there shall be no deadly cause of war between you and the High King. And how if the Splendor Hyaline is at Cair Paravel before you? I do not look for that with these winds, O my father. And lastly, O my resourceful son, said the Tisroc, you have made clear how all this might give you the barbarian woman, but not how it helps me to the overthrowing of Narnia. O my father, can it have escaped you that though I and my horsemen will come and go through Narnia like an arrow from a bow, yet we shall still have Anvard forever? And when you hold Anvard, you sit at the very gate of Narnia, and your garrison in Anvard can be increased by little and little till it is a great host. It is spoken with understanding and foresight, but how do I draw back my arm if all this miscarries? You shall say that I did it without your knowledge, and against your will, and without your blessing, being constrained by the violence of my love and the impetuosity of youth. And how if the High King then demands that we send the barbarian woman, his sister? Oh, my father, be assured that he will not. For though the fancy of a woman has rejected this marriage, the High King Peter is a man of prudence and understanding, who will in no way wish to lose the high honor and advantage of being allied to our house, and seeing his nephew and grandnephew on the throne of Calormen. He will not see that I live forever, as to no doubt your wish, said the Tisroc, in an even drier voice than usual. And also, O my father, and O the delight of my eyes, said the prince, after a moment of awkward silence, we shall write letters as if from the queen to say that she loves me and has no desire to return to Narnia, for it is well known that women are as changeable as weathercocks, and even if they do not wholly believe the letters, they will not dare to come to Dashban in arms to fetch her. O enlightened vizier, said the Tisroc, bestow your wisdom upon us concerning this strange proposal. O eternal Tisroc, answered Ahoshta, the strength of paternal affection is not unknown to me, and I have often heard that sons are in the eyes of their fathers more precious than carbuncles. How then shall I dare freely to unfold to you my mind in a matter which may imperil the life of this exalted prince? Undoubtedly you will dare, replied the Tisroc, because you will find that the dangers of not doing so are at least equally great. To hear is to obey, moaned the wretched man. Know then, O most reasonable Tisroc, in the first place, that the danger of the prince is not altogether so great as might appear, for the gods have withheld some of the barbarians the light of discretion, as that their poetry is not, like ours, full of choice apophthegms and useful maxims, but is all of love and war. Therefore nothing will appear to them more noble and admirable than such a mad enterprise as this of Ow! For the prince at the word mad had kicked him. Desist, O my son, said the Tisroc, and you, estimable vizier, whether he desists or desires or not, or whether he desists or not, by no means allow the flow of your eloquence to be interrupted, for nothing is more suitable to persons of gravity and decorum than to endure minor inconveniences with consistency. To hear is to obey, said the vizier, wriggling himself round a little as to get his hinder parts further away from Radabash's toes. Nothing, I say, will seem as pardonable, if not estimable, in their eyes as this, hazardous attempt, especially because it is undertaken for the love of a woman. Therefore, if the prince by misfortune fell into their hands, they would assuredly not kill him. Nay, it may even be that though he failed to carry off the queen, yet the sight of his great valor and of the extremity of his passion might incline her heart to him. That is a very good point, old babbler, said Rabadash. Very good. However, it came into your ugly head. The praise of my masters is the light of my eyes, said Ahoshta, and secondly, O Tisroc, who reigns must and shall be interminable, I think that with the aid of the gods it is very likely that Anvard will fall into the prince's hands, and if so, we have Narnia by the throat. There was a long pause, and the room became so silent that the two girls hardly dared to breathe. At last the Tisroc spoke. Go, my son, he said, and do as you have said, but expect no help nor countenance from me. I will not avenge you if you are killed, and I will not deliver you if the barbarians cast you into prison. And if, either in success or failure, you shed a drop more than you need of Narnian noble blood, and open war arises from it, My favor shall never fall upon you again, and your next brother shall have your place in Cullerman. Now go. Be swift, secret, and fortunate. Thank you, Tiger. May the strength of Tash the inexorable, the irresistible, be in your sword and lance. O Vizier, said the Tiz... To hear is to obey, cried Rabadash, and after kneeling for a moment to kiss his father's hands, he rushed from the room, greatly to the disappointment of Aravis, who was now horribly cramped. The Tisroc and Vizier remained. O Vizier, said the Tisroc, it is certain that no living soul knows of this council we three have held here tonight. O my master, said Ahoshta, it is not possible that any should know. For that very reason I proposed, that you and your wisdom agreed, that we should meet here in the old palace where no council is ever held, and none of the household has any occasion to come. It is well, said the Tisroc. If any man knew, I would see to it that he died before an hour had passed. And do you also, O prudent Vizier, forget it. I sponge away from my own heart and from yours all knowledge of the prince's plans. He has gone without my knowledge or my consent. I know not whither, because of his violence and the rash and disobedient disposition of youth. No man will be more astonished than you and I to hear that Anvard is in his hands. To hear is to obey. That is why you will never think, even in your secret heart, that I am the hardest hearted of fathers, who thus sends his firstborn son on an errand so likely to be his death, pleasing as it must be to you, who do not love the prince, for I see into the bottom of your mind. O impeccable Tisroc, said the Vizier, in comparison with you, I love neither the prince nor my own life, nor bread nor water, nor the light of the sun. Your sentiments, said the Tisroc, are elevated and correct. I also love none of these things in comparison with the glory and strength of my throne. If the prince succeeds, we have Archenland, and perhaps hereafter Narnia. If he fails, I have 18 other sons, and Rabadash, after a manner of the eldest sons of kings, was beginning to be dangerous. More than 5 Tisrocs in Tashban have died before their time, because their eldest sons, enlightened princes, grew tired of waiting for their throne. He had better cool his blood abroad than boil it in inaction here. And now, O excellent Vizier, the excess of my paternal anxieties inclines me to sleep. Command the musicians to my chamber, but before you lie down, call back the pardon we wrote for the third cook. I feel within me the manifest prognostics of indigestion. To hear is to obey, said the Grand Vizier. He crawled backward on all fours to the door, rose, bowed, and went out. Even then the Tisroc remained seated in silence on the divan till Aravis, almost beginning to be afraid that he had dropped asleep, but at last, with a great creaking and sighing, he heaved up his enormous body, signed to the slaves to precede him with the lights, and went out. The door closed behind him. The room was once more totally dark, and the 2 girls could breathe freely again. "How dreadful! How perfectly dreadful!" whispered Lasarline. "Oh, darling, I am so frightened. I'm shaking all over. Feel me." "Come on," said Aravis, who was trembling herself. "They've gone back to the new palace. Once we're out of this room, we're safe enough. But it's wasted a terrible time. Get me down to that water gate as quick as you can." "Darling, how can you?" squeaked Lasarline. "I can't do anything. Not now. My poor nerves. No, we must just lie still a bit, and then go back." "Why back?" asked Aravis. "Oh, you don't understand. You're so unsympathetic," said Lasarline, beginning to cry. Erebus decided it was no occasion for mercy. Look here, she said, catching Lasaraline and giving her a good shake. If you say another word about going back, and if you don't start taking me to the Watergate at once, do you know what I'll do? I'll rush out of the passage and scream. Then we'll both be caught. But we shall both be killed, said Lasaraline. Didn't you hear what the Tisroc, may he live forever, said? Yes, and I'd sooner be killed than married to a Hoshta. So come on. Oh, you are unkind, said Lasaraline. And I in such a state. But in the end she had to give in to Erebus. She led the way down the steps they had already descended, and along another corridor, and so finally out into the open air. They were now in the palace garden, which sloped down in terraces to the city wall. The moon shone brightly. One of the drawbacks about adventures is that when you come to the most beautiful places, you are often too anxious and hurried to appreciate them. So that Erebus, though she remembered them years later, had only a vague impression of gray lawns, quietly bubbling fountains, and long black shadows of cypress trees. When they reached the very bottom, and the wall rose frowning above them, Lasaraline was shaking so much that she could not unbolt the gate. Erebus did it. There at last was the river, full of reflected moonlight, and a little landing stage, and a few pleasure boats. "Good-bye," said Erebus, "and thank you. I'm sorry if I've been a pig, but think what I'm flying from." "Oh, Erebus, darling," said Lasaraline, "won't you change your mind, now that you've seen what a very great man Ahoshta is?" "Great man," said Erebus. "A hideous, groveling slave who flattens when he's kicked, or who flatters when he's kicked, but treasures it all up and hopes to get his own back by egging on that horrible Tisroc to plot his son's death. Faugh! I'd sooner marry my father's scullion than a creature like that." "Oh, Arvis, Arvis, how can you say such dreadful things? And about the Tisroc, may he live forever, too. It must be right if he's going to do it." "Good-bye," said Erebus. "And I thought your dresses were lovely. And I think your house is lovely, too. I'm sure you'll have a lovely life, though it wouldn't suit me. Close the door softly behind me." She tore herself away from her friend's affectionate embraces, stepped into a punt, cast off, and a moment later was out in mid-stream with a huge real moon overhead and a huge reflected moon down, deep down in the river. The air was fresh and cool, and as she drew nearer the farther bank she heard the hooting of an owl. Ah, that's better, thought Erebus. She had always lived in the country and had hated every minute of her time in Tashbaan. When she stepped ashore she found herself in darkness, for the rise of the ground and the trees cut off the moonlight, but she managed to find the same road that Shasta had found, and came just as he had done to the end of the grass and the beginning of the sand, and looked, like him, to her left and saw the big black tombs. And now at last, brave girl though she was, her heart quailed. Supposing the others weren't there, supposing the ghouls were, but she stuck out her chin, and a little bit of her tongue too, and went straight toward them. But before she had reached them, she saw Bree and Hwin and the groom. "You can go back to your mistress now," said Erebus, quite forgetting that he couldn't until the city gates opened next morning. "Here is money for your pains." "To hear is to obey," said the groom, and at once set off at a remarkable speed in the direction of the city. There was no need to tell him to make haste. He also had been thinking a good deal about ghouls. For the next few seconds Erebus was busy kissing the noses and patting the necks of Hwin and Bree, just as if they had been ordinary horses. "And here comes Shasta. Thanks be to the lion," said Bree. Erebus looked round, and there, bright enough, was Shasta, who had come out of hiding the moment he saw the groom going away. "And now," said Erebus, there's not a moment to lose, and in hasty words she told them about Rapidash's expedition. Treacherous hounds, said Bree, shaking his mane and stamping his hoof. An attack in time of peace, without defiance sent. But we'll grease his oats for him. We'll be there before he is. Can we? Said Aravis, swinging herself into Hwin's saddle. Shasta wished he could mount like that. Broo, snorted Bree. Up you get, Shasta. Can we? And with a good start, too. He said he was going to start at once, said Aravis. That's how humans talk, said Bree. But you don't get a company of 200 horses and horsemen, watered and victualled, and armed and saddled and started, all in a minute. Now, what's our direction? Due north? No, said Shasta. I know about that. I've drawn a line. I'll explain later. Bear a bit to our left, both you horses. Ah, here it is. Now, said Bree, all about galloping for a day and a night, like in stories. Can't really be done. It must be walk and trot, but brisk trots and short walks. And whatever we walk, you two humans can slip off and walk too. Now, are you ready, Hwin? Off we go. Narnia and the North. At first it was delightful. The night had now been going on for so many hours, and the sand had almost finished giving back all the sun heat it had received during the day, and the air was cool, fresh, and clear. Under the moonlight, the sand, in every direction, and as far as they could see, gleamed as if it were smooth water or a great silver tray. Except for the noise of Bree's and Hwin's hoofs, there was not a sound to be heard. Shasta would nearly have fallen asleep if he had not had to dismount and walk every now and again. This seemed to last for hours. Then there came a time when there was no longer any moon. They seemed to ride in the dead darkness for hours and hours, and after that there came a moment when Shasta noticed that he could see Bree's neck and heard in front of him a little more clearly than before, and slowly, very slowly, he began to notice the vast gray flatness on every side. It looked absolutely dead, like something in a dead world, and Shasta felt quite terribly tired, and noticed that he was getting cold and that his lips were dry. And all the time he the squeak of the leather, the jingle of the bits, and the noise of the hoofs, not proppity proppity, as it would be on hard road, but thubbity thubbity on dry sand. At last, after hours of riding, far away on his right, there came a single long streak of paler gray, low down on the horizon, then a streak of red. It was the morning at last, but without a single bird to sing about it. He was glad of the walking bits now, for he was colder than ever. Then suddenly the sun rose and everything changed in a moment. The gray sand turned yellow and twinkled as if it were strewn with diamonds. On their left the shadows of Shasta and Hwin and Bree and Aravis, enormously large, raced back behind them. The double peak of the Mount Pyre far ahead flashed in the sunlight, and Shasta saw they were a little out of the course. A bit left, a bit left, he sang out. Best of all, when you looked back, Tashbaan was already small and remote. The tombs were quite invisible, swallowed up in that single jagged edge hump which was the city of Tisroc. Everyone felt better. But not for long. Though Tashbaan looked very far away when they first saw it, it refused to look any farther away as they went on. Shasta gave up looking back on it, for it only gave him the feeling that they were not moving at all. Then the light became a nuisance. The glare of the sand made his eyes ache, but he knew he mustn't shut them. He must screw them up and keep them on looking ahead at Mount Pyre and shouting out directions. Then came the heat. He noticed it for the first time when he had to dismount and walk. As he slipped down to the sand, the heat from it struck up into his face, as if from the opening of an oven door. Next time it was far worse, but the third time, as his bare feet touched the sand, He screamed with pain and got one foot back in the stirrup and the other half over Bree's back before you could have said knife. Sorry, Bree, he gasped. I can't walk. It burns my feet. Of course, panted Bree. Should have thought of that myself. Stay on. Can't be helped. It's all right for you, said Shasta to Aravis, who was walking beside Hwen. You've got shoes on. Aravis said nothing, but looked prim. Let's hope she didn't mean to, but she did. On again, trot and walk and trot. Jingle, 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 squeak, squeak, squeak. Smell of hot horse, smell of hot self. Blinding glare, headache, and nothing at all different for mile after mile. Toshban would never look any farther away. The mountains would never look any nearer. You felt this had been going on for always. Jingle, 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 squeak, squeak, squeak. Smell of hot horse, smell of hot self. Of course, one tried all sorts of games with oneself to try to make the time pass, but of course they were all no good, and one tried very hard not to think of drinks. Iced sherbet in the palace in Tashban, clear spring water tinkling with a dark earthy sound, cold, smooth milk just creamy enough and not too creamy, and the harder you tried not to think, the more you thought. At last there was something different. A mass of rock stirring up out of the sand, about 50 yards long and 30 feet high. It did not cast much shadow, for the sun was now very high, but it cast a little. Into that shade they crowded. There they ate some food and drank a little water. It was not easy giving a horse a drink out of the skin bottle, but Bree and Hwen were clever with their lips. Not one had anything like enough. No one spoke. The horses were flecked with foam from the breathing. The children were pale. After a very short rest, they went on again. Same noises, same smells, same glare, till at last their shadows began to fall on their right, and then got longer and longer, till they seemed to stretch out to the eastern end of the world. Very slowly the sun drew nearer to the western horizon. And now at last he was down and, thank goodness, the merciless glare was gone, though the heat coming up from the sand was still as bad as ever. 4 pairs of eyes were looking out eagerly for any sign of the valley that Swallowpad the raven had spoken about. But, mile after mile, there was nothing but level sand. And now the day was quite definitely done, and most of the stars were out, and still the horses thundered on, and the children rose and sang in their saddles, miserable with thirst and weariness. Not till the moon had risen did Shasta, in the strange barking voice of someone whose mouth is perfectly dry, shout it out, "There it is!" There was no mistaking it now. Ahead and a little to their right there was at last a slope downward, and hummocks of rock on each side. The horses were far too tired to speak, but they swung round toward it, and in a minute or two they were entering the gully. At first it was worse in there than it had been out in the open desert, for there was a breathless stuffiness between the rock walls and less moonlight. The slope continued steeply downward, and the rocks on either hand rose to the height of cliffs. Then they began to meet vegetation, prickly cactus-like plants and coarse grass of the kind that would prick your fingers. Soon the horse hoofs were falling on pebbles and stones instead of sand. Round every bend of the valley, it had many bends, they looked eagerly for water. The horses were nearly at the end of their strength now, and Hwen, stumbling and panting, was lagging behind Bree. They were almost in despair, before at last they came into a little muddiness, and a tiny trickle of water through softer and better grass. And the trickle became a brook, and the brook became a stream with bushes on each side, and the stream became a river, and there came, after more disappointments than I could possibly describe, a moment when Shasta, who had been in a kind of doze, suddenly realized that Bree had stopped, and found himself slipping off. Before them a little cataract of water poured into a broad pool, and both the horses were already in the pool with their heads down, drinking, drinking, drinking. "Oh," said Shasta, and plunged in. It was about to his knees, and stood his head right into the cataract. It was perhaps the loveliest moment in his life. It was about 10 minutes later when all four of them, the two children wet nearly all over, came out and began to notice their surroundings. The moon was now high enough to peep down into the valley. There was soft grass on both sides of the river, and, beyond the grass, trees and bushes sloped up to the bases of the cliffs. There must have been some wonderful flowering shrubs hidden in that shadowy undergrowth, for the whole glade was full of the coolest and most delicious smells. And out of the darkest recesses among the trees came a sound Shasta had never heard before, a nightingale. Everyone was much too tired to speak or to eat. The horses, without waiting to be unsaddled, lay down at once, and so did Erebus and Shasta. About 10 minutes later, the careful Hwen said, "But we mustn't go to sleep. We've got to keep ahead of the Rapidash." "No," said Bray very slowly. "Mustn't go to sleep. Just a little rest." Shasta knew for a moment that they would all go to sleep if he didn't get up and do something about it, and felt that he ought to. In fact, he decided that he would get up and persuade them to go on. But presently, not yet. Just not yet. Very soon the moon shone, and the nightingale sang over two horses and two human children, all fast asleep. It was Erebus who woke first. The sun was already high in the heavens, and the cool morning hours were already wasted. "It's my fault," she said to herself furiously, as she jumped up and began rousing the others. One wouldn't expect horses to keep awake after a day's work like that, even if they can talk, and of course the boy wouldn't. He's had no decent training, but I ought to have known better. The others were dazed and stupid with the heaviness of their sleep. "Hi ho, broo-hoo," said Bree. "Been sleeping in my saddle, eh? I'll never do that again. Most uncomfortable." "Oh, come on," said Erebus. "We've lost half the morning already. There isn't a moment to spare." "A fellow's got to have a mouthful of grass," said Bree. "I'm afraid we can't wait," said Erebus. "What's the terrible hurry?" said Bree. "We've crossed the desert, haven't we?" "But we're not in Archenland yet," said Erebus. "And we've got to get there before Rabadash." "Oh, we must be miles ahead of him," said Bree. "Haven't we been coming a shorter way? Didn't that raven friend of yours say it was a shortcut, Shasta?" "He didn't say anything about shorter," answered Shasta. "He only said better, because you got to a river this way. If the oasis is due north of Tashbaan, then I'm afraid this may be longer." "Well, I can't go on without a snack," said Bree. "Take off my bridle, Shasta." "But please," said Hwen very shyly. "I feel just like Bree, and I can't go on." "But when horses have humans, with spurs and things, on their backs, aren't they often made to go on when they're feeling like this? And then they find they can? I mean, oughtn't we be able to do even more, now that we're free? It's all for Narnia." "I think, ma'am," said Bree very crushingly, "that I know a little more about campaigns and forced marches and what a horse can stand than you do." To this Hwen made no answer, being, like most highly bred mares, a very nervous and gentle person, who was easily put down. In reality, she was quite right, and if Bree had had a Tarkan on his back at that moment to make him go on, he would have found he was good for several hours' hard going. But one of the worst results of being a slave and being forced to do things is that when there is no one to force you any more, you find you have almost lost the power of forcing yourself. So they had to wait while Bree had a snack and a drink, and of course Hwen and the children had a snack and a drink too. It must have been nearly 11 o'clock in the morning before they finally got going again, and even then Bree took things much more gently than yesterday. It was really Hwen, though she was the weaker and more tired of the two, who set the pace. The valley itself, with its brown, cool river and grass and moss and wildflowers, and rhododendrons was such a pleasant place that it made you want to ride slowly. After they had ridden for several hours down the valley, it widened out, and they could see what was ahead of them. The river which had been flowing here joined a broader river, wide and turbulent, which flowed from their left to their right, toward the east. Beyond this new river, a delightful country rose gently in low hills, ridge beyond ridge, to the northern mountains themselves. To the right there was rocky pinnacles, one or two of them with snow clinging to the ledges. To the left, pine-clad slopes, frowning cliffs, narrow gorges, and blue peaks stretched away as far as the eye could reach. Shasta could no longer make out Mount Pyre. Straight ahead, the mountain range sank to a wooded saddle, which of course must be the pass from Archenland into Narnia. Broo-hoo-hoo, the north, the green north, neighed Bree, and certainly the lower hills looked greener and fresher than anything that Erebus and Shasta, with their southern-bred eyes, had ever imagined. Spirits rose as they clattered down to the water's meet of the two rivers. The eastern flowing river, which was pouring from the higher mountains at the western end of the range, was far too swift and too broken with rapids for them to think of swimming in it. But after some casting about, up and down the bank, they found a place shallow enough to wade. The roar and clatter of water, the great swirl against the horses' fetlocks, the cool, stirring air, and the darting dragonflies filled Shasta with a strange excitement. "Friends, we are in Archenland," said Bree proudly, as he splashed and churned his way out on the northern bank. "I think that river we've just crossed is called the Winding Arrow." "I hope we're in time," murmured Hwin. Then they began going up, slowly and zigzagging a good deal, for the hills were steep. It was all open park-like country, with no roads or houses in sight. Scattered trees, never thick enough to be a forest, were everywhere. Shasta, who had lived all his life in an almost treeless grassland, had never seen so many or so many kinds. If you had been there you would have probably known he didn't that they were seeing oaks, beeches, silver birches, rowans, and sweet chestnuts. Rabbits scurried away in every direction as they advanced, and presently they saw a whole herd of fallow deer making off among the trees. "Isn't it simply glorious?" said Erebus. At the first ridge Shasta turned in the saddle and looked back. There was no sign of Tashbaan. The desert, unbroken except by the narrow green crack down which they had traveled down, spread into the horizon. "Hello!" he said suddenly. "What is that?" "What's what?" said Bree, turning round. Hwin and Erebus did the same. "That," said Shasta, pointing. "It looks like smoke. Is it a fire?" "Sandstorm, I should say," said Bree. "Not much wind to raise it," said Erebus. "Oh!" exclaimed Hwin. "Look! There are things flashing in it. Look! They're helmets and armor, and it's moving this way." "By Tash," said Erebus, "it's the army. It's Rabadash." "Of course it is," said Hwin. "Just what I was afraid of. Quick! We must get to Anvard before it." And without another word she whisked round and began galloping north. Bree tossed his head and did the same. "Come on, Bree, come on," yelled Erebus over her shoulder. The race was very grueling for the horses. As they topped each ridge they found another valley, and another ridge beyond it, and though they knew they were going in more or less the right direction, no one knew how far it was to Anvard. From the top of the second ridge Shasta looked back again. Instead of a dust-colored well out of the desert, he now saw a black moving mass, rather like ants, on the far bank of the Winding Arrow. They were doubtless looking for a fjord. "They're on the river," he yelled wildly. "Quick, quick!" shouted Arvis. "We might as well not have come at all if we don't reach Anvard in time. Gallop, Bree, gallop! Remember, you're a war horse." It was all Shasta could do to prevent himself from shouting out similar instructions, but he thought, "The poor chap's doing all he can already, and held his tongue. And certainly both horses were doing, if not all they could, all they thought they could, which is not quite the same thing. Bree had caught up with Hwin, and they thundered side by side over the turf. It didn't look as if Hwin could possibly keep up much longer. At the moment, everyone's feelings were completely altered by a sound from behind. It was not the sound they had been expecting to hear. The noise of hooves and jingling armor mixed, perhaps, with colorman battle cries. Yet Shasta knew it at once. It was the same snarling roar he had heard that moonlit night when they first met Aravis and Hwin. Bree knew it too. His eyes gleamed red, and his ears lay flat on the back of his skull. And Bree now discovered that he had not really been going as fast, not quite as fast, as he could. Shasta felt the change at once. Now they were really going all out. In a few seconds they were well ahead of Hwin. It's not fair, thought Shasta. I did think we'd be safe from lions here. He looked over his shoulder. Everything was only too clear. A huge tawny creature, its body low to the ground, like a cat streaking across the lawn to a tree when a strange dog has got into the garden, was behind them. And it was nearer every second and half-second. He looked forward again and saw something which he did not take in, or even think about. Their way was barred by a smooth green wall about 10 feet high. In the middle of that wall there was a gate, open. In the middle of the gateway stood a tall man dressed down to his bare feet in a robe colored like autumn leaves, leaning on a straight staff. His beard fell almost to his knees. Shasta saw this in a glance and looked back again. The lion had almost got Hwen now. It was making snaps at her hind legs, and there was no hope now in her foam-flecked, wide-eyed face. "Stop!" bellowed Shasta in Bree's ear. "Must go back. Must help." Bree always said afterward that he never heard or never understood this. And as he was in general a very truthful horse, we must accept his word. Shasta slipped his feet out of the stirrups, slid both his legs over the left side, hesitated for one hideous hundredth of a second, and jumped. It hurt horribly and nearly winded him, but before he knew it hurt him he was staggering back to help Aravis. He had never done anything like this in his life before, and hardly knew why he was doing it now. One of the most terrible noises in the world, a horse's scream, broke from Hwen's lips. Aravis was stooping low over Hwen's neck and seemed to be trying to draw her sword. And now all three, Aravis, Hwen, and the lion, were almost on top of Shasta. Before they reached him, the lion rose on its hind legs, larger than you would have believed a lion could be, and jabbed at Aravis with its right paw. Shasta could see all the terrible claws extended. Aravis screamed and reeled in the saddle. The lion was tearing her shoulders. Shasta, half mad with horror, managed to lurch toward the brute. He had no weapon, not even a stick or a stone. He shouted out idiotically at the lion, as if one would at a dog, "Go home! Go home!" For a fraction of a second he was staring right into its wide-opened, raging mouth. Then, to his utter astonishment, the lion, still on its hind legs, checked itself suddenly, turned head over heels, picked itself up, and rushed away. Shasta did not for a moment suppose it had gone for good. He turned to race for the gate in the green wall which, now for the first time, he remembered seeing. Hwen, stumbling and nearly fainting, was just entering the gate. Aravis still kept her seat, but her back was covered in blood. "Come in, my daughter, come in," the robed and bearded man was saying, and then, "Come in, my son." As Shasta panted up to him, he heard the gate close behind him, and the bearded stranger was already helping Aravis off her horse. They were in a wide and perfectly circular enclosure, protected by a high wall of green turf. A pool of perfectly still water, so full that the water was almost exactly level with the ground, lay before him. At one end of the pool, completely overshadowing it with its branches, grew the hugest, most beautiful tree that Shasta had ever seen. Beyond the pool was a little house of stone roofed with deep and ancient thatch. There was a sound of bleating, and over at the far side of the enclosure there were some goats. The level ground was completely covered with the finest grass. Are, are, are you, panted Shasta, are you King Loon of Archenland? The old man shook his head. No, he replied in a quiet voice. I am the hermit of the Southern March. And now, my son, waste no time on questions, but obey. This damsel is wounded. Your horses are spent. Rabadash is at this moment finding a ford over the winding arrow, and if you run now without a moment's rest, you will be in time to warn King Loon. Shasta's heart fainted at these words, for he felt he had no strength left, and he writhed inside at what seemed the cruelty and unfairness of the demand. He had not yet learned that if you do one good deed, your reward usually is to be set to do another and harder and better one. But all he said out loud was, "Where is the king?" The hermit turned and pointed with his staff. "Look," he said, "there is another gate, right opposite to the one you just entered. Open it and go straight ahead, always straight ahead. Another level or steep, over smooth or rough or dry or wet. I know by my art that you will find King Loon straight ahead. But run, run, always run." Shasta nodded his head, ran to the northern gate, and disappeared beyond it. Then the hermit took Erebus, whom he had all this time been supporting with his left arm, and half led, half carried her into the house. After a long time he came out. "Now, cousins," he said to the horses, "it is your turn." Without waiting for an answer, and indeed they were too exhausted to speak, he took the bridles and saddles off both of them. Then he rubbed them both down, so well that a groom in the king's stable could not have done it better. "There, cousins," he said, "dismiss it all from your minds, and be comforted. Here is water, and there is grass. You shall have hot mash when I have milked my other cousins, the goats." "Sir," said Hwen, finding her voice at last, "will the Tarkina live? Has the lion killed her?" "I I who know many present things by my art," replied the hermit with a smile, "have yet little knowledge of things future. Therefore I do not know whether any man or woman or beast in the whole world will be alive when the sun sets tonight. But be of good hope. The damsel is likely to live as long as any of her age." When Erebus came to herself, she found that she was lying on her face on a low bed of extraordinary softness in a cool, bare room with walls of undressed stone. She couldn't understand why she had been laying on her face, but when she tried to turn, and felt the hot, burning pains all over her back, she remembered, and realized why. She couldn't understand what delightful springy stuff the bed was made of, because it was made of heather, which is the best bedding, and heather was a thing she had never heard of. The door opened, and the hermit entered, carrying a large wooden bowl in his hand. After carefully setting this down, he came to the bedside, and asked, "How do you find yourself, my daughter?" "My back is very sore, father," said Erebus, "but there is nothing else wrong with me." He knelt beside her, laid his hand on her forehead, and felt her pulse. "There is no fever," he said. "You will do well. Indeed, there is no reason why you should not get up tomorrow. But now, drink this." He fetched the wooden bowl and held it to her lips. Erebus couldn't help making a face when she tasted it, for goat's milk is rather a shock when you are not used to it. But she was very thirsty and managed to drink it all, and felt better when she had finished. Now, my daughter, you may sleep when you wish, said the hermit, for your wounds are washed and dressed, and though they smart, they are no more serious than if they had been cuts of a whip. It must have been a very strange lion, for instead of catching you out of the saddle and getting his teeth into you, he has only drawn his claws across your back. 10 scratches, sore, but not deep or dangerous. I say, said Aravis, I have had luck. Daughter, said the hermit, I have now lived 109 winters in this world, and have never yet met any such thing as luck. There is something about all this that I do not understand, but if ever we need to know it, you may be sure that we shall. And what about Rabadash and his 200 horses? Said Aravis. They will not pass this way, I think, said the hermit. They must have found a ford by now, well to the east of us. From there they will try to ride straight into Anvard. Poor Shasta, said Aravis. Has he far to go? Will he get there first? There is good hope of it, said the old man. Aravis laid down again, on her side this time, and said, Have I been asleep for a long time? It seems to be getting dark. The hermit was looking out of the only window, which faced north. It is not the darkness of night, he said presently. The clouds are falling down from Stormness Head. Our foul weather always comes from there in these parts. There will be thick fog tonight. Next day, except for her sore back, Aravis felt so well that after breakfast, which was porridge and cream, the hermit said she could get up, and of course she at once went out to speak to the horses. The weather had changed, and the whole of that green enclosure was filled, like a great green cup, with sunlight. It was a very peaceful place, lonely and quiet. Hwin at once trotted across to Aravis and gave her a horse kiss. But where's Bree? Said Aravis, when each had asked of the other's health and sleep. Over there, said Hwin, pointing with her nose to the far side of the circle, and I wish you'd come and talk to him. There's something wrong. I can't get a word out of him. They strolled across and found Bree lying with his face toward the wall, and though he must have heard them coming, he never turned his head or spoke a word. Good morning, Bree, said Aravis. How are you this morning? Bree muttered something that no one could hear. The hermit says that Shasta probably got to King Lune in time, continued Aravis, so it looks as if all our troubles are over. Narnia at last, Bree. I shall never see Narnia, said Bree in a low voice. Aren't you well, Bree dear? Said Aravis. Bree turned round at last, his face mournful as only a horse's can be. I shall go back to Calormen, he said. What? Said Aravis. Back to slavery? Yes, said Bree. Slavery is all I'm fit for. How can I ever show my face among the free horses of Narnia? I, who left a mare and a girl and a boy to be eaten by lions, while I galloped all I could to save my own wretched skin. We all ran as hard as we could, said Hwin. Shasta didn't, snorted Bree. At least he ran in the right direction. Ran back. And that is what shames me most of all. I, who call myself a war horse, and boasted of 100 fights, to be beaten by a little human boy, a child, a mere foal, who had never held a sword, nor any good nurture or example in his life. I know, said Aravis. I felt just the same. Shasta was marvelous. I'm just as bad as you, Bree. I've been snubbing him and looking down on him ever since you met us, and now he turns out to be the best of us all. But I think it would be better to stay and say we're sorry than to go back to Calormen. It's all very well for you, said Bree. You haven't disgraced yourself, but I've lost everything. My good horse, said the hermit, who had approached them unnoticed because his bare feet made so little noise on the sweet, dewy grass. My good horse, you've lost nothing but your self-conceit. No, no, cousin, don't put back your ears and shake your mane at me. You really are so humbled as you sounded a minute ago. You must learn to listen to sense. You are not quite the great horse you had come to think. from living among poor dumb horses. Of course you were braver and cleverer than them. You could hardly help being that. But it doesn't follow that you'll be anyone very special in Narnia. But as long as you know you're nobody special, you'll be a very decent sort of horse, on the whole, and taking one thing with another. And now, if you and my other four-footed cousin will come round the kitchen door, we'll see that the other half of that is mash. When Shasta went through the gate, he found a slope of grass and a little heather running up before him to some trees. He had nothing to think about now, and no plans to make. He had only to run, and that was quite enough. His limbs were shaking, a terrible stitch was beginning in his side, and the sweat that kept dripping into his eyes blinded them and made them smart. He was unsteady on his feet, too, and more than once he nearly turned his ankle on a loose stone. The trees were thicker now than they had been, and in more open spaces there was bracken. The sun had gone in without making it any cooler. It had become one of those hot, gray days when there seemed to be twice as many flies as usual. Shasta's face was covered with them. He didn't even try to shake them off. He had too much else to do. Suddenly he heard a horn. Not a great throbbing horn like the horns of Tashban, but a merry call. Tiro ti ti ho. Next moment he came out into a wide glade and found himself in a crowd of people. At least, it looked like a crowd to him. In reality, there were about 15 or 20 of them, all gentlemen in green hunting dress, and their horses, some in the saddle, some standing by their horses' heads. In the center, someone was holding the stirrup for a man to mount, and the man was holding it for was the jolliest, fattest, most apple-cheeked, twinkling-eyed king you could imagine. As soon as Shasta came in sight, this king forgot all about mounting his horse. He spread out his arms to Shasta, his face lit up, and he cried out in a great, deep voice that seemed to come from the bottom of his chest, "Corin, my son, and on foot, and in rags? What? No," panted Shasta, shaking his head. "Not Prince Corin. I I know I'm like him. Saw his Highness in Tashban. Sent his greetings." The king was staring at Shasta with an extraordinary expression on his face. "Are you King Loon?" gasped Shasta, and then, without waiting for an answer, "Lord King, fly! Onvard! Shut the gates! Enemies upon you! Rabadash and 200 horse." "Have you assurances of this, boy?" asked one of the other gentlemen. "My own eyes," said Shasta. "I've seen them. Raced them all the way from Tashban." "On foot?" said the gentleman, raising his eyebrows a little. "Horses. With the hermit," said Shasta. "Question him no more, Darin," said the king, Loon. "I see the truth in his face. We must ride for it, gentlemen. A spare horse there, for the boy. You can ride fast, friend." For answer, Shasta put his foot in the stirrup of the horse, which had been led toward him. A moment later he was in the saddle. He had done it 100 times with Bree in the last few weeks, and his mounting was very different now from what it had been on the first night, when Bree had said he climbed up a horse as if he were climbing a haystack. He was pleased to hear the Lord Darin say to the king, "The boy has a true horseman's seat, sire. I'll warrant there are noble blood in him." "His blood, aye. There's the point," said the king, and he stared hard at Shasta again with that curious expression, almost a hungry expression, in his steady gray eyes. But by now the whole party was moving off at a brisk canter. Shasta's seat was excellent, but he was sadly puzzled as to what to do with his reins, for he had never touched the reins while he was on Bree's back. But he looked very carefully out of the corner of his eye to see what the others were doing, as some of us have done at parties when we aren't quite sure which knife or fork we are meant to use, and tried to get his fingers right. But he didn't dare. to try really directing the horse. He trusted it would follow the rest. The horse, of course, was an ordinary horse, not a talking horse, but he had quite wits enough to realize that the strange boy on his back had no whip and no spurs, and was not really a master of the situation, and that's why Shasta soon found himself at the tail end of the procession. Even so, he was going pretty fast. There were no flies now, and the air in his face was delicious. He had got his breath back, too, and his errand had succeeded. For the first time since the arrival at Tashbaan, how long ago it seemed! He was beginning to enjoy himself. He looked up to see how much nearer the mountain tops had come. To his disappointment, he could not see them at all, only a vague grayness rolling down toward them. He had never been in mountain country before, and was surprised. "It's a cloud," he said to himself. "A cloud coming down, I see. Up here in the hills one is really in the sky. I shall see what the inside of a cloud is like. What fun! I've often wondered." Far away on his left, and a little behind him, the sun was getting ready to set. They had come to a rough kind of road, but now and were by now and were making very good speed. But Shasta's horse was still the last of the lot. Once or twice, when the road made a bend, there was now continuous forest on either side of it. He lost sight of the others for a second or two. Then they plunged into the fog, or else the fog rolled over them. The world became gray. Shasta had not realized how cold and wet the inside of a cloud would be, nor how dark. The gray turned to black with alarming speed. Someone at the head of the column winded the horn every now and then, and each time the sound came from a little farther off. He couldn't see any of the others now, but of course he'd be able to as soon as he got round the next bend. But when he rounded it, he still couldn't see them. In fact, he couldn't see nothing at all. His horse was walking now. "Get on, horse, get on," said Shasta. Then came the horn, very faint. Bree had always told him he must keep his heels well turned out, and Shasta got the idea that something very terrible would happen if he dug his heels into his horse's side. This seemed to him an occasion for trying it. "Look here, horse," he said, "if you don't buck up, do you know what I'll do? I'll dig my heels into you. I really will." The horse, however, took no notice of this threat, so Shasta settled himself firmly into the saddle, gripped with his knees, clenched his teeth, and punched on both the horse's sides with his heels as hard as he could. The only result was that the horse broke into a kind of pretense of a trot for 5 or 6 paces, and then subsided into a walk again. And now it was quite dark, and they seemed to have given up blowing that horn. The only sound was a steady drip drip from the branches of the trees. "Well, I suppose even a walk will get us somewhere sometime," said Shasta to himself. "I only hope I shan't run into Rabadash and his people." He went on for what seemed a long time, always at a walking pace. He began to hate that horse, and he was also beginning to feel very hungry. Presently, when he came to a place in the road divided into two, he was just wondering which led to Anvard, when he was startled by the noise from behind him. It was the noise of trotting horses. "Rabadash," thought Shasta. He had no way of guessing which road Rabadash would take. "But if I take one," said Shasta to himself, "he may take the other, and if I stay at the crossroads, I'm sure to be caught." He dismounted and led his horse quickly as he could along the right-hand road. The sound of the cavalry grew rapidly nearer, and any minute or two Shasta realized that they were at the crossroads. He held his breath, waiting to see which way they would take. There came a low word of command. "Halt!" Then a moment of horsey noises, nostrils blowing, hooves pawing, bits being champed, necks being patted, and the voice spoke. "Attend, all of you," it said. "We are now within a furlong of the castle. Remember your orders. Once we are in Narnia, we should be by sunrise. You are to kill as little as possible. On this venture you are to regard every drop of Narnian blood as more precious than a gallon of your own. On this venture, I say, the gods will send us a happier hour, and then you must leave nothing alive between Cair Paravel and the western waste. But we are not yet in Narnia. Here in Archenland it is another thing, and the assault on this castle of King Lune's, nothing matters but speed. Show your mettle. It must be mine within an hour, and if it is, I'll give it all to you. I reserve no booty for myself. Kill me every barbarian male within its walls, down to the child that is born yesterday, and everything else is yours to divide as you please. The women, the gold, the jewels, the weapons, and the wine. The man that I see hanging back when we come to the gates shall be burned alive. In the name of Tosh the irresistible, the inexorable, forward! With a great clippity clop, the column began to move, and Shasta breathed again. They had taken another road. Shasta thought they took a long time going past, for though he had been talking and thinking about 200 horse all day, he had not realized how many they really were. But at last the sound died away, and once more he was alone amid the drip drip from the trees. He now knew the way to Anvard, but of course he could not now go there, but would only mean running into the arms of Rabadash's troops. What on earth am I to do? Said Shasta to himself, but he remounted his horse and continued along the road he had chosen, in the faint hope of finding some cottage where he might ask for shelter and a meal. He had thought, of course, of going back to Erebus and Bree and Hwin at the Hermitage, but he couldn't because by now he had not the least idea of the direction. After all, said Shasta, this road is bound to get somewhere. But all that depends on what you mean by somewhere. The road kept on getting to somewhere in the sense that it got more and more trees, all dark and dripping, and to colder and colder air, and strange icy winds kept blowing the mist past him, though they never blew it away. If he had been used to mountain country, he would have realized that this meant he was now very high up, perhaps right at the top of the pass. But Shasta knew nothing about mountains. I do think, said Shasta, that I must be the most unfortunate boy that ever lived in the whole world. Everything goes right for everyone except me. Those Narnian lords and ladies got safely away from Tashbaan. I was left behind. Erebus and Bree and Hwen are all as snug as anything, with the old hermit. Of course I was the one who was sent on. King Lune and his people must have gotten safely into the castle and shut the gates long before Rabadash arrived. But I got left out. And being very tired and having nothing inside him, he felt so sorry for himself that tears rolled down his cheeks. What put a stop to all this was a sudden fright. Shasta discovered that someone or somebody was walking beside him. It was pitch dark, and he could see nothing, and the thing or person was going so quietly that he could hardly hear any footfalls. What he could hear was breathing. His invisible companion seemed to breathe on a very large scale, and Shasta got the impression that it was a very large creature. And he had some notice this breathing so gradually that he had really no idea how long it had been there. It was a horrible shock. It darted into his mind that he had heard long ago that there were giants in these northern countries. He bit his lip in terror, but now that he really had something to cry about, he stopped crying. The thing, unless it was a person, went on beside him so very quietly that Shasta began to hope he had only imagined it. But just as he was becoming quite sure of it, there suddenly came a deep, rich sigh out of the darkness beside him. That couldn't be imagination. Anyway, he had felt the hot breath of the sigh on his chilly left hand. If the horse had been any good, or if he had known how to get any good out of the horse, he would have risked everything on a breakaway and wild gallop. But he knew he couldn't make that horse gallop, so he went on at a walking pace, and the unseen companion walked and breathed beside him. At last he could bear it no longer. "Who are you?" he said, scarcely above a whisper. "One who was wait one who has waited long for you to speak," said the thing, its voice not loud, but very large and deep. Are you are you a giant? Asked Shasta. You might call me a giant, said the large voice, but I am not like the creatures you call giants. I can't see you at all, said Shasta, after staring very hard. Then, for an even more terrible idea had come into his head, he said, almost in a scream, You're not something dead, are you? Oh, please, please do go away. What harm have I ever done to you? Oh, I am the unluckiest person in the whole world. Once more he felt the warm breath of the thing on his hand and face. There, it said, that is not the breath of a ghost. Tell me your sorrows. Shasta was a little reassured by the breath, so he told how he had never known his real father or mother and had been brought up sternly by the fishermen. And then he told the story of his escape, and how they were chased by lions and forced to swim for their lives, and of all their dangers in Tashbaan, and about his night among the tombs, and how the beasts howled at him out in the desert, and how he told of the heat and thirst of their desert journey, and how they were almost at their goal when another lion chased them and wounded Aravis, and also how very long it had been since he had anything to eat. I do not call you unfortunate, said the large voice. Do you think it was bad luck to meet so many lions? Said Shasta. There was only one lion, said the voice. What on earth do you mean? I've just told you there were at least two the first night, and there was only one, but he was swift of foot. How do you know? I was the lion. And as Shasta gaped, with open mouth, and said nothing, the voice continued. I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile so that you would reach King Loon in time. And I was the lion you do not remember who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so that it came to shore where a man sat, wakeful at midnight, to receive you. Then it was you who wounded Aravis. It was I. But what for? Child, said the voice, I am telling you your story, not hers. I tell no one any story but his own. Who are you? Asked Shasta. Myself, said the voice, very deep and low so that the earth shook, and again, myself, loud and clear and gay, and then the third time, myself, whispered so softly you could hardly hear it, and yet it seemed to come from all around you as if the leaves rustled with it. Shasta was no longer afraid that the voice belonged to something that would eat him, nor that it was the voice of a ghost, but a new and different sort of trembling came over him. Yet he felt glad, too. The mist was turning from black to gray, and from gray to white. This must have begun to happen some time ago, but while he had been talking to the thing, he had not been noticing anything else. Now the whiteness around him became a shining whiteness. His eyes began to blink. Somewhere ahead of him he could hear birds singing. He knew the night was over at last. He could see the mane and ears and head of the horse quite easily now. A golden light fell on them from the left. He thought it was the sun. He turned and saw, pacing beside him, taller than the horse, a lion. The horse did not seem to be afraid of it, or else did not see it. It was from the lion that the light came. No one ever saw anything more terrible or beautiful. Luckily, Shasta had lived all his life too far south in Kullerman to have heard the tales that were whispered in Tashbaan about a dreadful Narnian demon who appeared in the form of a lion. And of course he knew none of the true stories about Aslan, the great lion, the son of the Emperor over the sea, the king above all high kings in Narnia. But after one glance at the lion's face, he slipped out of the saddle and fell at its feet. He couldn't say anything, but then he didn't want to. He knew he needn't say anything. The High King above all kings stooped toward him. its mane, and some strange and solemn perfume that hung about the mane was all around him. It touched his forehead with its tongue. He lifted his face to meet their eyes. Then instantly the pale brightness of the mists and the fiery brightness of the lion rolled themselves together into a swirling glory and gathered themselves up and disappeared. He was alone with the horse on a grassy hillside under a blue sky, and there were birds singing. Was it all a dream? Wondered Shasta. But it couldn't have been a dream, for there was a grass before him. He saw a deep, large print of a lion's front right paw. It took one's breath away to think of the weight that could make a footprint like that. But there was something more remarkable than the size about it. As he looked at it, water had already filled the bottom of it. Soon it was full to the brim, and then overflowing, and a little stream was running downhill past him over the grass. Shasta stooped and drank, a very long drink, and then dipped his face in and splashed his head. It was extremely cold and clear as glass, and refreshed him very much. After that he stood up, shaking the water out of his ears and flinging the wet hair back from his forehead, and began to take stock of his surroundings. Apparently it was still very early morning. The sun had only just risen, and had risen out of the forest which he saw low down and far away on his right. The country which he was looking at was absolutely new to him. It was a green valley land dotted with trees through which he caught the gleam of a river that wound away roughly to the northwest. On the far side of the valley there were high and even rocky hills, but they were lower than the mountains he had seen yesterday. Then he began to guess where he was. He turned and looked behind him and saw that the slope on which he was standing belonged to a range of far higher mountains. I see, said Shasta to himself. Those are the big mountains between Archenland and Narnia. I was on the other side of them yesterday. I must have come through the pass at night. What luck that I hit. At least, it wasn't luck at all really. It was him. And now I'm in Narnia. He turned and unsaddled his horse, and took off its bridle. Though you are a perfectly horrid horse, he said. It took no notice of this remark, and immediately began eating grass. That horse had a very low opinion of Shasta. I wish I could eat grass, thought Shasta. It's no good going back to Onvard. It'll be besieged. I'd better get lower down into the valley and see if I can get anything to eat. So he went on downhill. The thick dew was cruelly cold on his bare feet, till he came into a wood. There was a kind of track running through it, and he had not followed this for many minutes when he heard the thick and rather wheezy voice saying to him, "Good morning, neighbor." Shasta looked round eagerly, to find the speaker was presently a small, prickly person with a dark face, who had just come out from among the trees. At least, it was small for a person, but very big indeed for a hedgehog, which was what it was. "Good morning," said Shasta, "but I'm not a neighbor. In fact, I'm a stranger in these parts." "Ah?" said the hedgehog inquiringly. "I've come over the mountains, from Archenland, you know." "Ah, Archenland," said the hedgehog. "That's a terribly long way. Never been there myself." "I think, perhaps," said Shasta, "someone ought to be told that there's an army of savage Colormanes attacking Onvard at this very moment." "You don't say so," answered the hedgehog. "Well, think of that. They do say that Colorman is hundreds of thousands of miles away, right at the world's end, across a great sea of sand." "It's not nearly as far as you think," said Shasta. "And oughtn't something be done about this attack on Onvard? Oughtn't your High King be told?" "Certain sure. Something ought to be done about it," said the hedgehog. "But you see, I'm just on my way to bed for a good day's sleep. Hello, neighbor." The last words were addressed to an immense biscuit-colored rabbit whose head had just popped up from somewhere beside the path. The hedgehog immediately told the rabbit what it had just learned from Shasta.
The rabbit agreed that this was very remarkable news and that somebody ought to tell someone about it, with a view of doing something. And so it went on. Every few minutes they were joined by other creatures, some from the branches overhead, and some from little underground houses at their feet, till the party consisted of 5 rabbits, a squirrel, 2 magpies, a goat-foot fawn, and a mouse, who all talked at the same time and all agreed with the hedgehog. For the truth was that in that golden age, when the witch and the winter had gone and Peter the High King ruled at Caraparavel, the smaller woodland people of Narnia were so safe and happy that they were getting a little careless. Presently, however, 2 more practical people arrived in the little wood. One was a red dwarf whose name appeared to be Duffel, and the other was a stag, a beautiful lordly creature with wide liquid eyes, dappled flanks, and legs so thin and graceful that they looked as if you could break them with 2 fingers. "Lion alive!" roared the dwarf, as soon as he heard the news. "And if that's so, why are we all standing here still, chittering? Enemies at Anvard? News must be sent to Cair Paravel at once. The army must be called out. Narnia must go to the aid of King Loon." "Ah," said the hedgehog, "but you won't find the High King at Cair. He's away to the north, trouncing those giants. Talking of giants, neighbors, that puts me in mind. Who'll take our message?" interrupted the dwarf. "Anyone here got more speed than me?" "I've got speed," said the stag. "What's my message?" "How many color means?" "200, under Prince Rabidash, and—" But the stag was already away, all 4 legs off the ground at once. In a moment its white stern had disappeared among the remoter trees. Excuse me. "I wonder where he's going," said the rabbit. "He won't find the High King at Cair Paravel, you know." "He'll find Queen Lucy," said Duffel. And then, "Hullo! What's wrong with that human? It looks pretty green. Why, I do believe it's quite faint. Perhaps it's mortal hungry. When did you last have a meal, youngster?" "Yesterday morning," said Shasta weakly. "Come on, then, come on," said the dwarf, at once throwing his thick arms across Shasta's waist to support him. "Why, neighbors, we all ought to be ashamed of ourselves. You come with me, lad. Breakfast. Better than talking." With a great deal of bustle, muttering reproaches to itself, the dwarf had led and half supported Shasta a great speed farther into the wood and a little downhill. It was a longer walk than Shasta wanted at that moment, and his legs had begun to feel shaky before they came out from the trees into bare hillside. There they found a little house with a smoking chimney and an open door, and as they came to the doorway, Duffel called out, "Hey, brothers, a visitor for breakfast." And immediately, mixed with a sizzling sound, there came to Shasta a simply delightful smell. It was one he had never smelt in his life before, but I hope you have. It was, in fact, the smell of bacon and eggs and mushrooms all frying in a pan. "Mind your head, lad," said Duffel, a moment too late, for Shasta had already bashed his forehead against the low lintel of the door. "Now," continued the dwarf, "sit you down. The table's a bit low for you, but then the stool's low too. That's right. And here's porridge. And here's a jug of cream. And there's a spoon." By the time Shasta had finished his porridge, the dwarf's 2 brothers, whose names were Rogan and Bricklethumb, were putting the dish of bacon and eggs and mushrooms, and the coffee pot of hot milk, and the toast, or coffee pot and the hot milk, and the toast on the table. It was all new and wonderful to Shasta, for color mean food is quite different. He didn't even know what the slices of brown stuff were, for he had never seen toast before. He didn't know what the yellow soft thing they smeared on the toast was, because in Colormene you always get oil instead of butter, and the house itself was quite different from the dark, frowsty, fish-smelling hut of Arshish, and from the pillared and carpeted halls in the palaces of Tashbaan. The roof was very low, and everything was made of wood, and there was a cuckoo clock, and a red and white checkered tablecloth, and a bowl of wildflowers, and little curtains on the thick paneled windows. It was also rather troublesome, having to use dwarf cups and plates and knives and forks. This meant that helpings were very small, but then there was a great many helpings, so that Shasta's plate or cup were to be filled every moment, and every moment the dwarfs themselves were saying, "Butter, please," or "Another cup of coffee," or "I'd like to try a few mushrooms." Or "What about frying another egg or so?" And then at last they had all eaten as much as they possibly could. The three dwarfs drew lots for who would do the washing up, and Rogan was the unlucky one. Then Dwaffle and Bricklethumb took Shasta outside to a bench which ran against the cottage wall, and they all stretched out their legs and gave a great sigh of contentment, and the two dwarfs lit their pipes. The dew was off the grass now, and the sun was warm. Indeed, if there hadn't been a light breeze, it would have been too hot. "Now, stranger," said Duffel, "I'll show you the lie of the land. You can see nearly all South Narnia from here, and we're rather proud of the view. Right away on your left, beyond those hills, you can see the Western Mountains, and that round hill away on your right is called the Hill of the Stone Table. Just beyond—" But at that moment he was interrupted by the snore from Shasta, who, what with his night's journey and his excellent breakfast, had fallen fast asleep. The kindly dwarfs, as soon as they noticed this, began making signs to each other not to wake him, and indeed did so much whispering and nodding and getting up and tiptoeing away that they certainly would have waked him if he had been less tired. He slept pretty well nearly all day, but woke up in time for supper. The beds in that house were all too small for him, but they made him a fine bed of heather on the floor, and he never stirred nor dreamed all night. Next morning they had just finished breakfast when they heard a shrill, excited sound from outside. "Trumpets," said the dwarfs, as they and Shasta all came running. The trumpets sounded again, a new noise to Shasta, not huge and solemn like the horns of Tashbaan, or gay and merry like King Loon's hunting horn, but clear and sharp and valiant. The noise was coming from the woods to the east, and soon there was a noise of horse hoofs mixed with it. A moment later the head of the column came into sight. First was Lord Peridon on a bay horse carrying a great banner of Narnia, a red lion on a green ground. Shasta knew him at once. Then came three people riding abreast, two on their chargers and one on a pony. The two on the chargers were King Edmund and a fair lady with a very merry face, who wore a helmet and a mail shirt and carried a bow across her shoulder and a quiver full of arrows at her side. "The Queen Lucy," whispered Duffel, but the one on the pony was Corin. After that, the main body of the army, men on ordinary horses, men on talking horses, who didn't mind being ridden on proper occasion, as when Narnia went to war, centaurs, stern, hard-bitten bears, great talking dogs, and last of all 6 giants, for there were good giants in Narnia. But though they were on the right side, Shasta at first could hardly bear to look at them. There are some things that take a lot of getting used to. Just as the king and queen reached the cottage and the dwarfs began making low bows to them, King Edmund called out, "Now, friends, time for a halt and a morsel." And at once there was a great bustle of people dismounting and haversacks being opened and conversation beginning, when Corin came running up to Shasta and seized both of his hands and cried, "What, you here? So you got through all right? I am glad. Now we shall have some proper sport. And isn't it luck? We only got in the harbor at Cair Paravel yesterday morning when the very first person who met us was Shirvey the Stag with this news of an attack on Onvard. Don't you think— Who is your highness's friend? The king said King Edmund, who was just off his horse. Don't you see, sire, said Corin? It's my double, the boy you mistook for me at Tashbaan. Why, so he is your double, exclaimed Queen Lucy, and like his two twins. This is a marvelous thing. Please, your majesty, said Shasta to King Edmund, I was no traitor, really I wasn't, and I couldn't help hearing your plans, but I'd never have dreamed of telling them to your enemies. I know now that you are no traitor, boy, said King Edmund, laying his hand on Shasta's head, but if you wouldn't be taken for one, another time try not to hear what's meant for other ears, but all's well. After that there was so much bustle and talk and coming and going that Shasta for a few minutes lost sight of Corin and Edmund and Lucy. But Corin was the sort of boy whom one is sure to hear of pretty soon, and it wasn't very long before Shasta heard King Edmund say in a loud voice, "By the lion's mane, Prince, this is too much. Will your highness never be better? You are more of a heart scald than our whole army together. I'd as lief had a regiment of hornets in my command as you." Shasta wormed his way through the crowd, and there saw Edmund looking very angry indeed, Corin looking a little ashamed of himself, and a strange dwarf sitting on the ground making faces. A couple of fawns had apparently just been helping it out of its armor. "If I had but my cordial with me," Queen Lucy was saying, "I could soon mend this. But the High King has so strictly charged me not to carry it commonly to the wars, and kept it only for great extremities." What has happened was this. As soon as Corin had spoken to Shasta, Corin's elbow had been plucked by a dwarf in the army called Thornbutt. "What is it, Thornbutt?" Corin had said. "Your Royal Highness," said Thornbutt, drawing him aside, "our march today will bring us through the pass and right to your royal father's castle. We may be in battle before night." "I know," said Corin. "Isn't it splendid?" "Splendid or not," said Thornbutt, "I have the strictest orders from King Edmund to see to it that your highness is not in the fight. You will be allowed to see it, and that's treat enough for your highness's little years." "Oh, what nonsense!" Corin burst out. "Of course I'm going to the fight. Why, Queen Lucy's going to be with the archers." "The Queen's Grace will do as she pleases," said Thornbutt, "but you are in my charge. Either I must have your solemn and princely word that you'll keep your pony beside mine, not half a neck ahead, till I give your highness leave to depart, or else, it is his majesty's word, we must go with our wrists tied together like two prisoners." "I'll knock you down if you try to bind me," said Corin. "I'd like to, I'd like to see your highness do it," said the dwarf. It was quite enough for the boy, like Corin, and in a second he and the dwarf were at it hammer and tongs. It would have been an even match, for, though Corin had longer arms and more height, the dwarf was older and tougher. But it was never fought out. That's the worst of fights on a rough hillside. For by very bad luck Thornbutt trod on a loose stone, came flat down on his nose, and found when he tried to get up that he had sprained his ankle, a really excruciating sprain which would keep him from walking or riding for at least a fortnight. "See what your highness has done," said King Edmund. "Deprived us of a very proved warrior on the very edge of battle." "I'll take his place, sire," said Corin. "Pshaw!" said Edmund. "No one doubts your courage, but a boy in battle is a danger only to his own side." At that moment the king was called away to attend something else, and Corin, after apologizing handsomely to the dwarf, rushed out to Shasta and whispered, "Quick! There's a spare pony now, and the dwarf's armor. Put it on before anyone notices." "What for?" said Shasta. "Why, so you and I can fight in the battle, of course. Don't you want to?" "Oh, yes, of course," said Shasta, but he wasn't thinking of doing so at all, and began to get most uncomfortably prickly feeling in his spine. "That's right," said Corin. "Over your head. Now the sword belt. But we must ride near the tail of the column and keep as quiet as mice. Once the battle begins, everyone will be far too busy to notice."
And I am going to leave there for tonight, and I will finish it tomorrow when I start my stream. Thank you, everyone, for showing up, and we're going to go ahead and raid Sagrel. So, thank you, everyone, for showing up and for listening to me read. Um, I really appreciate you guys all being here. And we will, hopefully, I will see you guys tomorrow. All right? Say hi to Sagrel for me.